few years, there's been some misconceptions about a particular molecule known as ivermectin. So let's break down exactly how this drug works. Now, ivermectin is used to treat parasitic infections, and specifically, it's going to target nerve cells on those parasites. And that's because nerve cells are really important for communication in those parasites that allows them to move. However, if we zoom in even closer on those nerve cells, specifically on the cell membrane, we'll see that there are a variety of different channels. And you can think of these channels like doors that open or close. Sometimes they let in certain molecules like salts and sugars, and in exchange they might let out other molecules like amino acids. Now, ivermectin is specifically going to target one of those channels that's known as a glutamate chloride receptor, or channel. And specifically, it's going to keep that channel open. And that allows for more chloride to keep coming in to that nerve cell. That causes a hyperpolarization, meaning that there's now too much chloride within that nerve cell, and that's going to lead to paralysis. And eventually, that's going to lead to the death of the parasite. So that's the mechanism of action of how ivermectin is used to help treat parasitic infections.
Well, hello there. Thank you for joining me today. It may look like this is going to be a pretty simple show. Ivermectin, right? We all heard it nonstop during COVID. It became one of the most controversial drugs in the world during that time. But there's really a much, much bigger story. I first ran across ivermectin years ago while researching Jimmy Carter, Africa, and river blindness. At the time, I had no idea it was one of the largest public health campaigns in history. And actually, it started with a short clip that I saw. For whatever reason, I clicked on this clip about the Carter Center in Georgia. And within a minute or two of that clip, first thing I saw was a bottle of what looked like worms on Jimmy Carter's desk. And then also, there were a couple of statues on the property of children who had suffered from river blindness. And at the time, I thought, wow, strange that you would have a bottle on your desk of these worms-looking things, right? And these sculptures. And it really stayed with me because I kept thinking, what is going on there in Africa with this river blindness? And why does Jimmy Carter have statues of blind African children and a bottle of worms on his desk? Well, sadism is probably the reason, kind of looking at it like fondly, right? So, if someone were exploring the hypothesis that ivermectin had a harmful hidden purpose, they would naturally look first at Africa, because that is where multiple historical streams converged over many decades. Tropical medicine research dating back to the colonial era. Africa also had heavy military and intelligence interests during the Cold War. Biological warfare programs in some countries were documented, though separate from ivermectin. Large international health campaigns led by governments, pharmaceutical companies. Who are you going to call? The World Health, the World Bank, NGOs, and universities. The world's largest long-term pharmaceutical donation program was distributed in Africa. More than 5 billion, you heard me right, 5 billion ivermectin treatments since 1987. Viewed through that lens, one could argue, if ivermectin had been intentionally developed or used as a biological weapon rather than a therapeutic drug, Africa would have become the principal theater of its deployment. No other continent received the same substantial scale of treatment over nearly 4 decades, involving billions of doses, millions of people, and an unprecedented international infrastructure dedicated to repeated administrations. What makes the history noteworthy is not just the number of tablets, those pills handed out, but the concentration of effort. Overlapping in Africa were scientific discoveries, field trials, disease surveillance, international financing, pharmaceutical manufacturing, mass drug administration, long-term epidemiology monitoring, ongoing tropical disease research. And you may be wondering, gee, I wonder if Ashford's in this picture. Yes, hold on to your hats. Ashford will be in this picture in a while here. It actually gets a little bit worse because Japan is in the picture. But let me keep reading here. From a historical perspective, few places on Earth have experienced that degree of sustained international medical engagement that has happened with ivermectin. That is why Africa occupies such a central place in the history of ivermectin. Whether one views that history as an extraordinarily humanitarian achievement, an example of global health governance, or something warranting deeper scrutiny depends on how one interprets the historical record. They're also talking now about cancer, and they're also talking about aspirin is now a problem in people's minds. Well, so let's talk about ivermectin. Is it a bioweapon or is it here to help? Remember, I'm always saying evil has to come packaged as help, right? So let's take a look at some of the countries that did not have any river blindness, okay? Russia never had river blindness. China didn't. Japan, most of Europe, Canada, the United States, and Australia, A lot of white people never got endemic river blindness, how it appears to me. The large, decades-long ivermectin donation campaign instead focused on endemic regions in Africa, Yemen, that was a mind-boggler, and limited parts of Latin America. So the primary source for using this ivermectin was in Africa, but also Yemen and limited parts of Latin America, which I will be getting to. And of course, during the COVID deal, we had a lot of public faces. I used to refer to them as the BitChute doctors, right? The ones running around yelling, oh my God, the sky is falling in. Don't trust anybody, but trust me and my group of doctors. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, a relatively small group of physicians, podcasters, authors, and media personalities became the most recognizable public advocates for ivermectin. The names that appeared over and over included Dr. Pierre Kory, Kory, Dr. Paul Marik, Marik. There was also the Frontline COVID-19 Critical Care Alliance, or the FLCCC, Joe Rogan, Brett Weinstein, Dr. Robert Malone, John Rappaport, Alex Jones, America's Frontline Doctors, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Dr. John Campbell. Collectively, they produced hundreds, and in some cases thousands of podcasts, interviews, videos, articles, newsletters discussing ivermectin. Most of their public messaging focused on ivermectin's long history as an anti-parasitic medicine, its widespread use around the world, the Nobel Peace Prize associated with its discovery, and arguments that it should be widely available during the pandemic. By comparison, discussions of potential side effects, contradictions, overdose risks, and uncommon but serious complications, such as neurological reactions associated with this infection I'll be explaining, in parts of Central Africa. And that received far less attention, I would say no attention. This observation of mine is not meant to suggest that these individuals never discussed safety. Rather, the overall emphasis of their public communications was generally on ivermectin's potential benefits, its history, and the surrounding policy debate, rather than providing a comprehensive review of its possible risks and adverse effects. And as far as the history, no, they really didn't explain the entire history. They focused in on a very specific time. Since that pandemic, some of these same figures and others in the alternative health community have expanded their public discussions to include claims that ivermectin may have benefits for cancer. Laboratory and animal studies have investigated ivermectin's effects on cancer cells, but it is not an approved cancer treatment, and there is currently no high-quality clinical evidence showing that ivermectin cures cancer in humans. But research in this area is still ongoing. So I'm going to be introducing a whole bunch of characters, so let's go slow here so we don't get overwhelmed. In 2015, a man named Omura, O-M-U-R-A, he won the Nobel Prize for the discovery of what is called avermectins, which ultimately led to ivermectin. So then in 2020 to 2021, researchers around the world investigate whether existing drugs, including ivermectin, might be useful against COVID-19. 2021, Omura, the guy that won the Nobel Prize, he co-authors a review discussing the available evidence and supports continued investigation of ivermectin for COVID. So Omura, the winner who came up with ivermectin in 2021, said, yeah, we'll take a look at it. So then in 2021, ivermectin advocates begin citing him because he is the Nobel laureate associated with the drug's discovery. But based on everything I've searched so far, Omura, I have not found him discussing the neurological complications in his COVID-era papers or statements. Alex Jones, I have not found him discussing any neurological issues. John Rappaport, same again. Robert Malone, a man named Del Bigtree, zip. Peter Corey, zip. Peter McCullough, zip. Joseph Mercola, nothing. So a couple of them mentioned Omura as the inventor of ivermectin. But basically, so then what Omura did was in 2021, he said, okay, we're going to do a clinical trial. Well, in January of 2022, laboratory antiviral findings were announced. September 2022, human phase 3 trial reports did not demonstrate efficacy over the placebo. So then the next month, October 2022, the company that was doing the testing publicly states it would not pursue approval for COVID-19 treatments for ivermectin. So the people that actually created the drug out of Japan, and that will be another fascinating part here, they did a study and said, no, we're going to take a pass. We don't see any future with ivermectin and this COVID thing. But the September-October 2022 announcement did not appear to significantly reduce enthusiasm among many ivermectin advocates. Instead, several things happened. Many supporters focused on earlier laboratory findings. There was a January 2021 rather than the later human trial results. Others argued that the phase 3 trials used the wrong dose, wrong timing, or wrong patient population, so they did not view the negative results as settling the question. Some shifted their emphasis from the trial to other studies, meta-analysis, or individual physicians they considered more persuasive. By late 2022, the debate had become highly polarized, with many participants placing greater trust in sources aligned with their existing views than in regulators or a single company's trial results. So, basically, September 2021, in the spring, April to May timeframe of 2021, ivermectin videos began spreading wildly on alternative platforms like BitChute. Summer of 2021, online telehealth companies, pharmacies, and marketers began aggressively promoting access to ivermectin. Ads commonly emphasize convenience, online consultations, and home delivery. So then a little bit further on, August to September of 2021, Facebook, Google, and other platforms were documented carrying or confronting ivermectin-related advertising, while alternative platforms such as BitChute and Rumble saw increasing numbers of creators discussing where to obtain it. Late 2021 and into 2022, sponsorships on some Rumble and BitChute channels expanded beyond discussions of ivermectin to include companies advertising telehealth services or pharmacies where viewers could obtain prescriptions or purchase the drug, often with promotional codes. And the basic theme was this: the government is lying to you. The pharmaceutical companies are hiding the cure. The mainstream media won't tell you the truth. We're independent researchers. We have nothing to gain. Trust us instead. So, a reoccurring feature of this media ecosystem was a repeated emphasis on independence. Hosts frequently describe themselves as independent journalists, independent researchers, or independent media, often contrasting themselves with governments, legacy media, pharmaceutical companies, and universities. This framing positioned the speaker as a more trustworthy alternative to established institutions. If they repeatedly claimed to be independent, why were they constantly interviewing each other, promoting each other, and often directing audiences toward the same products or services? That does not sound like independence to me. And if you think Alex Jones is independent, call me after the show. I have a deal for you. Jones was over there pushing zinc-containing supplements, multivitamins, silver products, immune support products. He even went as far as to sell you toothpaste and gargles that he suggested had antiviral properties. So what is going on? Let me explain something about this whole issue. I first uncovered ivermectin back when I was looking into the Carters in Africa. And then in the last year or so, I ran across a man named Tim Truth. That's the name he posts under, Tim Truth. Tim Truth about blew me backwards with his report about all of the horrific things about ivermectin. I'm not going to repeat them all right here because I did an entire show about it, because I consider Tim to be an excellent researcher. I've run into him in the past. I don't follow him or anything like that. I don't know him. I've never spoken to him, but he did the research that blew my head back, okay? Because here is the main issue. Ivermectin does leak into the brain. That is the part no one wants to really talk about. And here is what it says. Ivermectin is not completely excluded from the brain. So what's happening is small amounts get into the brain and then you go cuckoo, right? To complete neurological breakdown. So here's how the wording looks. Small amounts can cross the blood-brain barrier. And researchers have measured ivermectin in the central nervous system in both animal studies and indirectly in humans. At approved doses, concentrations in the brain are generally very low because they call it the P-glycoprotein transporter pumps much of the drug back out of the brain. So here's the claim. They're saying that in our brain, we have something called the P-glycoprotein. And they claim that if something hits your brain that's not supposed to be there, that this thing will kick in. It's called the transporter pump, and it says it will push the drug back out of the brain. Sounds great, right? So, but here's the catch. If that protective system is overwhelmed or impaired, such as with very high doses, certain drug interactions, some rare genetic variations affecting the P-glycoprotein or specific disease states, brain concentrations can increase and neurological toxicity becomes more likely. They also give ivermectin to dogs. They mix something else with it and they say, oh yeah, if you want your dog not to have heartworms, give them these pills every month. Well, I had it suggested to me many times with my dogs, and it never made sense. And I'd say, well, why would I want to give them this heartworm pill? And they said, well, because if your dog is ever exposed to this heartworm, horrible death, they're going to be very sad about it. The dog's going to have a miserable life, and you're going to be to blame, right? And I kept thinking, and I say, well, how would they get this heartworm? And they say, well, all it takes is if you're out camping. And I said, hey, but we don't go camping. We don't drink out of ponds and stuff. So how would that impact me? And that always kind of stumped them, right? Because, everything they would say that was needed to happen. I'd say, well, yeah, but that doesn't make sense. I don't think my dogs are exposed to this worm. So anyway, so here's what they're claiming. They're claiming that certain dog breeds, such as collies, Australian shepherds, and related breeds with this mutation, are unusually sensitive to ivermectin. They lack the normal transporter function that keeps ivermectin out of the brain. I call BS on this whole transporter thing, but here today, I'm going to presenting you with so many insane things that you're going to have to decide for yourself. Because here's what I think. I think they came up with this thing about, well, if you get too much in the brain, can't kick it out, and you become neurologically impaired. Nothing we could have done about it. Well, and here's what they claim. Ivermectin crosses the blood-brain barrier only to a limited extent under normal circumstances. Protective transport proteins keep brain concentrations low, but they do not prevent all entry. So let's wheel back this entire thing. Where did ivermectin even come from in the first place? Well, interesting story. It came out of Japan. And the story gets so fascinating. I'm just going to give you the overview now. So in the 1970s in Japan, researchers recognized that ivermectin's effects were limited because the blood-brain barrier protected mammals. And in the 1980s to 1990s, veterinarians observed in collies and laboratory mouse studies, and they identified this thing as a key mechanism limiting ivermectin accumulation in the brain of dogs. So then in the 2000s onward, they did human genetic studies and pharmacokinetic research, and they refined this understanding, showing that drug interactions and other factors can increase, pay attention, susceptibility to neurological toxicity. So for ivermectin, the concern has always been in parasites, ivermectin enters the nervous system and causes paralysis and death. In humans and most mammals, the blood-brain barrier, the P-glycoprotein transporter, usually keeps brain concentrations very low. So the drug primarily acts outside the brain at approved doses. You hear those words, approved doses, right? If too much ivermectin reaches the brain, possible central nervous system effects can include drowsiness or excessive sleepiness, dizziness, confusion, difficulty walking or loss of coordination, tremors, slowed speech, visual disturbances, seizures, coma. This is why researchers spent so much time studying whether ivermectin crosses the blood-brain barrier. But remember, they knew that from the very beginning. So, why didn't ivermectin usually harm mammals? Well, when Japanese scientists, and you're going to pay attention to these Japanese names, I'm going to make it as easy as I can because down the road here I got a bunch of Japanese names because here's my thought. I believe 100% right now, and I have no reason to bury the lead, that this ivermectin came out of Unit 731 in Japan. And you're going, oh, how could you have come up with that? Well, trust me, I did the work, okay? So this Omura guy I'm going to be talking about in Japan, who created ivermectin, I traced him all the way back because at first I thought, well, maybe he came out of Unit 731. No, he didn't because he was only 10 years old at the time. But then I thought, well, wait a minute, but that guy was trained by somebody, right? So then I went through all of his mentors and stuff. And yes, I am about as sure as I could possibly be that this whole deal got started in Unit 731. So the best way to solve this is for me to keep reading. I'm sure you've noticed I'm having some difficulties. This is from my exposure to sulfur. It has nothing to do with my intelligence level. It has nothing to do with my inability to research data, okay? You can stop with the comments about, oh, look, she can't talk. Yes, I can talk. It's just limited. Remember this. If you were like in the old mafia And you knew that this guy was going down, and he had something you wanted to know to help you save your life, right? And he said, "Come closer to me. I've got something to tell you about what we did in the mafia and how we destroyed your family. Come a little bit closer and I'll tell you." Just think of me as that mafia guy. Come a little bit closer and I'll tell you all the facts. But my delivery is no longer perfect. I've been at this for over 9 years. I'm being taken down by the government for my views. So that is all a fact. And that's the interesting fact also. Why am I being taken down? Why aren't the rest of these people pushing ivermectin and stuff on the hit list with the government? Oh, I forget. Because they're likely in on the plot, right? So let me just stick to the script here. I am very careful when I write up these scripts for these shows. I check and double check. Nothing in these scripts, even though I am in failing health, nothing in these scripts should be of any concern. I offer you everything I looked at down below in my show notes. I completed a complete web page for you on my website of everywhere I looked. But everywhere I looked won't be everything I'm going to talk about today. So anybody from this point forward can say, well, where'd she come up with that from? I have shown you my entire path, which is much more than any of these other people have even tried to do. So let's keep sticking with the facts here. So here's the thought. If ivermectin attacks the nervous system, why doesn't it also attack the human brain? The answer was believed to be the blood-brain barrier. The blood-brain barrier is a protective filtering system made of tightly packed cells lining the blood vessels in the brain. It allows oxygen and nutrients to enter while keeping many drugs and toxins out. Early researchers found that very little ivermectin reached the brain at normal doses, but you didn't hear me say none, right? Early researchers found that very little ivermectin reached the brain at normal doses. That explained why the drug could kill parasites without usually causing serious effects on the human central nervous system, which consists of the brain and spinal cord. As research continued throughout the 1980s and 1990s, scientists discovered the protection was even more sophisticated. The blood-brain barrier wasn't simply blocking ivermectin. This is their claim that a transport protein called P-glycoprotein was actively pumping ivermectin back out of the brain. Scientists later found that when certain dog breeds, especially collies, developed severe neurological reaction, those dogs carried a mutation gene, meaning they lacked enough functioning P-glycoprotein. Without that protective pump, much more ivermectin entered the brain, leading to neurological toxicity. What happened with this dog thing was, when I finished writing the show, I was looking around at clips, because I don't look for clips and stuff until I'm done, because I don't want somebody else's work to influence mine. I stand on my own. So I started looking at clips and shorts and all this stuff, and I saw a couple of disturbing clips about dogs that were in the throes of having some sort of breakdown. And what I didn't realize at the time, I was watching dogs in the final throes of being killed by ivermectin, the way it processed through their brain. So that's excuse me. So anyway, today researchers seem to understand that ivermectin does cross the blood-brain barrier in small amounts, and that's the part that becomes squiggly here, right? So this research became one of the key reasons scientists have continued to study ivermectin's pharmacology for more than 4 decades. It wasn't simply a question of whether ivermectin reached the brain. It was a question of how much, under what conditions, and what happened when the brain's protective mechanisms failed. From the very beginning, the scientists developing avermectin and ivermectin had to answer a basic pharmacological question. If this drug attacks the nervous system of worms, why doesn't it attack the nervous system of mammals? That wasn't an afterthought. It was one of the central safety questions during development. So what I'm saying to you essentially is this brain stuff was not unknown at any single point during all of this. It was known from the very, very beginning. Because in 1975 to 1978, Omura, that's O-M-U-R-A, put that name in your book, drill it in there. Omura isolated the streptomycin organism from soil, and Merck researchers purified the ivermectin. So this Omura guy is looking in the soil. And this part I find very interesting. Pay attention to the soil, okay? Because they're also using the soil now for this other stuff, right? With stuff that's going on right now. So with the stuff that I'm proposing is probably going to poison the whole world. But anyway, so this started in the soil. So late 1970s, before moving into broader animal and human development, researchers studied how the drug worked, where it distributed in the body, how it was metabolized, and whether it reached the brain. They recognized early that mammals generally tolerated the drug because brain exposure appeared to be very limited at therapeutic doses. As veterinary use expanded in the 1980s, unusual neurological reactions in certain dog breeds led scientists to investigate the mechanism further. By the 1990s, work on this transporter showed that the brain's protection was not absolute. It depended on an active transport system that kept ivermectin concentrations in the central nervous system low. This sequence is not unusual in drug development. When a compound acts on the nervous system of its intended target, developers routinely study whether it could also affect the human nervous system. In ivermectin's case, understanding its interaction with the brain was part of establishing its safety profile before widespread use. So yes, the blood-brain barrier, or BBB issue, is sometimes discussed as though it is unique to ivermectin, but it is not. Many drugs are designed to cross the blood-brain barrier, while others are specifically designed not to. And this part really got me going here, right? So they're actually saying right here that many drugs are designed to cross the blood-brain barrier. Not very refreshing news, is it? So what drugs are they talking about? Well, morphine, fentanyl, diazepam or Valium, Xanax, Prozac, antipsychotics, alcohol, nicotine, and caffeine. Yes, all of these are no bueno for your brain. I had no clue that they were actually designed to cross into the blood-brain barrier. And that's why people get so out of their minds when they start drinking alcohol, right? I stopped drinking caffeine in the last year when I was talking about it during a show because I thought, well, I'm only drinking a cup or two, but if it has anything to do with sleep disruption, I want it gone. So I stopped drinking it. I'm glad I did because it's not a good thing. So yeah, it's funny. And here are drugs that do not cross much, right? Penicillin, heparin, insulin, most large antibiotic drugs, many antibiotics unless the meninges are inflamed. These drugs work elsewhere in the body and either are too large or too water soluble to enter the brain easily. Well, that's kind of a relief, right? So just stick with penicillin and insulin and you'll be okay. Ivermectin, I'm not laughing because I find any of this funny. I'll explain to you in a little bit here when I get to the funding. I actually had probably one of the first meltdowns I've had doing this research over this ivermectin. When I realized how it was funded and the United States involvement, I kind of had a Well, I had a blackout feast for a couple of days. I was uncontrollably crying. It hit me so hard. So, ivermectin is actually interesting because under normal conditions, it penetrates the human brain very poorly. Several protective mechanisms keep it out. The most important is that P-glycoprotein, a transporter in the blood-brain barrier that actively pumps ivermectin back into the bloodstream if small amounts enter the barrier. I have a lot of issues with this, but I've never been in chemistry school or I've never worn that white coat, but something about this strikes me as very odd. So, and that's when problems can occur if somebody receives an overdose. The blood-brain barrier is impaired, or the P-glycoprotein is absent or inhibited, or there are other unusual biological circumstances. So, yeah, one reason the blood-brain barrier became a focus because people were asking about it, but nobody really got to that question, right? And here's the part that I found I don't know. I have no idea how I didn't know this, but it's pretty shocking. Many common medicines intentionally cross the blood-brain barrier. I'm not sure that's such a good thing. Ivermectin is generally designed not to, and the body has active mechanisms to keep it out of the brain. When neurological toxicity occurs, researchers look not only at the drug itself, but also at the dose, genetics, and integrity of the blood-brain barrier, drug interactions, and the underlying disease. So if you compare them like morphine, Valium, Prozac, alcohol, and nicotine specifically need to reach the brain. Ivermectin normally kept out of the brain by protective mechanisms. Statins, the things people are taking for their blood pressure, those mainly act in the liver. Some cross the blood-brain barrier more than others, but they are not intended to produce their primary effect in the brain. I think the fact that we have a bunch of drugs that enter your blood-brain is a big issue. And alcohol is also unusual because it is a small molecule that diffuses across blood-brain barrier easily, unlike many drugs that require specific transport mechanisms or actively kept out. This helps explain why people behave so differently while drinking. The regions affected include the frontal lobes, which are involved in judgment, planning, and impulse control. The cerebellum, which coordinates movement and balance. The hippocampus, which is critical for forming new memories, hence alcohol-induced blackouts. At higher levels, the brainstem, which controls breathing and heart rate. This is why severe alcohol poisoning can be life-threatening. So when people say alcohol lowers inhibitions, that's just not a figure of speech. The drug is directly interfering with the brain circuits that normally help regulate self-control, decision-making, and behavior. So basically, how this all laid out was after the drug was invented or created, however you want to word this, in Japan, and I have a lot more to say about all of this. Let me just give you an overview. After it was discovered, created, or whatever, 1987 to 1988, they did a very unusual thing. Merck, the pharmaceutical company, they had this thing called Merck's Mestizan Donation Program, and mass ivermectin distribution expanded across Africa. 1989 to 1991, as programs reached ivermectin naive populations in parts of Cameroon and neighboring regions, reports of severe neurological events began to accumulate. 1994 to 1995, another wave of reports occurred as the African program for onychar control expanded into additional, they call them Loa endemic areas. And here's the part that, you're going to have to decide. This Loa Loa thing sounds insane to me. And here's what they're saying. Well, if you take ivermectin and you have problems, well, maybe it's because you have Laua Laua. I know it sounds like I'm just making all this stuff up, right? So they only found Laua Laua in certain parts of Africa, which also makes it very interesting, right? So let's continue on. 1995 to 1997, researchers conducted formal investigations in Cameroon, where the first people went off their ticky-tickies, right? The landmark 1997 Lancet paper showed that the serious encephalology cases were strongly associated with people who had extremely high Lao microfilar loads before treatment. So they're saying that some people have this Lao business and no one knows anything about it. And then all of a sudden, whoops, everybody starts getting neurological problems. So now we think it's Lao. If it doesn't make sense now, it will make a tiny bit of sense later. But all in all, it will never make a lot of sense, okay? It's still today, this Lao stuff does not make any sense to me. So anyway, and then also, you have to figure that it jumped from Africa into Yemen and South America. Well, that's an interesting story in itself. But anyway, so the Lancet paper shows up claiming that this Lao business might get you, right? So late 1990s onward, programs changed their approach by increasing surveillance, identifying high-risk areas, modifying treatment strategies, and eventually developing screening approaches such as the test and not treat strategy for people with very high Lao levels. So, they actually started in 88 to 91 with mass treatments across Africa. Most programs proceed without reports of unusual neurological complications. But from 89 to 93, as treatment reaches parts of Cameroon and neighboring Central African countries, physicians begin reporting rare cases of coma and the brain thing going on after the ivermectin treatment. 1994 to 95, more cases are documented. Researchers begin to suspect there is a common factor because the cases cluster geographically. Well, once they figure that out, they're going to have to figure out how to get in Yemen and stuff, but I'll get back to that later. So anyway, so when I got to the part about Yemen, I thought, no, wait a minute, none of this is making sense. So anyways, 1995 to 1997, they identified the cause. Patients with severe reactions have extremely Lao microfilarial loads. The neurological illness is linked to the rapid death of massive numbers of Lao. So what they say is, if you have a lot of these Lao things in your system, I'm trying to not laugh and trying to explain this, then after the ivermectin treatment, all this Lao stuff will break loose in your system, so you'll have all these crazy effects going on. And I don't know, like I said, it's very fuzzy, but because in 1997 they published the landmark study in the Lancet, it established the association between very high Lao infection and post-ivermectin neurological issues. So in the late 1990s, the WHO, National Programs and Research, revised treatment strategies in high-risk areas. It's pretty amazing that they blasted Africa with all this stuff before they really understood this stuff, right? Kind of that's how these things work out, right? This, my friends, is what you call a global kill box. Africa is, in fact, the target. So, in the 2000s, programs adopt risk reduction measures, including better geographic screening and later targeted test and not treat approaches in some regions. 2010s to present, the Lao complication remains a recognized but uncommon risk in specific areas of Central Africa. So not everybody got the Lao, just a few central parts of Africa got it. So it is now incorporated into tropical medical guidelines, and the large wave of unexpected cases seen in the early years of mass treatment has not reoccurred at the same scale after these program changes. So the timeline shows that it took about 8 to 10 years after the start of this Merck donation program in 1987 until researchers clearly identified very high loa infection as a major risk factor for these rare neurological complications. And you'll notice the wording, they start calling them rare, right? Just like they call things natural, right? Yeah, natural earthquake. Well, nothing natural about any of these things. So in the early days, I want to prove this point home. Early development, 1970s to early 1980s, focused on questions such as, is ivermectin toxic to mammals? Does it enter the brain? What dose is safe? How is it metabolized? What are the effects in laboratory animals and early human studies? Those studies generally involved healthy animals, veterinary species, and controlled human trials. They were not designed to detect a rare interaction that would occur only in people with extremely high loa microfiltration burdens living in certain regions of Central Africa. The loa problem became apparent only when several conditions came together. Millions of people were treated in mass campaigns. Treatment expanded into areas where loa was common, but yet nobody knew about it right at the time. A very small subset of people had exponentially high parasite loads. Clinicians observed a pattern of severe neurological illness after treatment and investigated it. So it wasn't that researchers ignored brain safety for 8 to 10 years. Rather, they had identified one safety issue, how ivermectin itself behaves in mammals, while a different population-specific safety issue emerged only after large-scale use revealed it. Yeah, because they just hopped in there and started giving out pills, right? I'm obviously simplifying things, but basically that's kind of what happened, right? And then they claim, well, that sequence is not unique to ivermectin. Some rare adverse reactions are discovered only after a medicine is used in very large and diverse populations because clinical trials are usually far too small to detect events that occur. For example, once in tens of thousands of people or thousands of people. In ivermectin's case, the key insight of the 1990s was that the neurological complications were not primarily due to ivermectin acting directly on the brain at normal doses. Well, that is a statement that removes them from liability, right? The key insight of the 1990s was that the neurological complications were not primarily due to ivermectin acting directly on the brain at normal doses. See how that word is just, a lawyer wrote these words, okay? Instead, they were strongly associated with people who had extraordinarily high loa infections, where rapid killing of massive numbers of microvilli triggered the severe reaction. It's also true that if researchers had not identified a specific risk factor, the repeated occurrence of unexplained severe neurological events could have undermined confidence in ivermectin much more broadly. Public health programs generally depend on being able to explain adverse events and reduce their occurrences. Identifying, and listen to this statement here, identifying the association with loa gave investigators a biologically plausible explanation and a basis for changing practice. Before that discovery, the loa business, clinicians were seeing rare but alarming neurological events after ivermectin treatment in certain areas without a clear explanation. And this is the part that I just can't get over. Without a clear explanation. So nobody thought, hey, maybe it's the pills, right? I mean, I hate to be so simple-minded here, but really. Once researchers recognized that the case is clustered in people with very high LAWA loads, they could change things around. So, yeah, I don't know. If you think this is getting weird, just hang on to your hats here. So let's recap this. The pill gets discovered in Japan, right? Ivermectin. 1987, Merck, the drug company, which is owned by the USA, don't forget that, announced that it's called the Medicine Donation Program for River Blindness. And just like George Bush, out of the kindness of their hearts, the people at Merck Pharmaceutical just wanted to do good for river blindness in Africa. Here again, if you believe that part, call me later. I got some land I want to talk about selling you. So 1987, Merck announces this wonderful donation program to help river blindness. 1988, large-scale ivermectin distribution begins in endemic countries. 1989 to 1991, physicians in part of Cameroon begin reporting rare cases of coma and severe neurological illness after ivermectin treatment. At first, the cause is unknown. Yeah, everybody's running around scratching their head. Can't be the pill, can it? 1992 to 1994, additional cases are documented as treatment expands into more LAWA endemic areas of Central Africa. Investigators begin to suspect the events are geographically linked. Gee, really? 1995 to 1997, detailed investigations identify that very high LAWA loads as a major risk factor. A landmark 1997 Lancet paper establishes the association. So, full bore ahead, right? WHO, national programs, and researchers revise treatment strategies in affected regions, eventually leading to geographic risk mapping, enhanced surveillance, and later screening approaches. That was in 1990s. They started handing this stuff out in 1987. So they rolled along for about 10 years, gleefully handing out pills, right? So here's a rough progression. 1989 to early 1990s, people are developing severe neurological illness after ivermectin. Why, oh, why is this happening? Mid-1990s, these cases all seem to occur where LAWA is common. 1995 to 1997, patients with the most severe reactions have extraordinarily high LAWA burdens. That finding did not mean ivermectin played no role. The neurological syndrome occurred after ivermectin treatment. Rather, the evidence indicated that the risk was concentrated in a very specific group of patients with heavy LAWA infections, which allowed treatment programs to be modified instead of concluding that ivermectin posed the same risk to everyone. Pretty key statement there, right? So once they found LAWA, that allowed treatment programs to be modified instead of concluding that ivermectin posed the same risk to everyone. So let's play out who are the four main players. Well, first we have river blindness. It's really called onchoacogrosis. I'm just going to call it river blindness. River blindness is caused by a parasitic worm called Onchovaria vulvaris. It is spread, and pay attention to this, by black flies. The adult worm lives under the skin for 10 to 15 years and produces millions of tiny baby worms called microflaria. Those baby worms cause severe itching, skin disease, eye damage, and blindness. The next player in this scene is ivermectin. Ivermectin is the medicine used to control river blindness. Its main job is to kill baby worms. And in case you're wondering, why not kill the big worms? Well, that's a different story altogether. I can't. So they're letting the other worms live and they're killing the baby worms is how this is working, okay? So I don't find any logic here. So if you don't, welcome to my world. So here was the logic. By removing the baby worms, it relieves itching, helps prevent blindness, reduces the chance black flies spread the disease to other people. A single dose does not kill the adult worms, so treatment is repeated once or twice a year until the adult worms eventually die out naturally. So this is a long process. It takes those adult worms 15 years to die off. So during the whole process, oh, more pills, more pills, more pills, more pills, right? So the third player in this scene is Loa Loa. Loa Loa is a completely different parasite. It causes what's called loesis, African eyeworm disease, and it is spread by deer flies, not black flies. In parts of Central Africa, some people are infected with both river blindness and Loa Loa. Most people tolerate ivermectin well. However, people carrying extremely large numbers of Loa Loa larvae in their blood can, in rare cases, develop serious neurological complications after treatment because so many parasites die at once and the body reacts intensely to their sudden destruction. And there's a fourth character in this party here. It's called the Wolbachia bacteria, Wolbachia. This is one more important piece. Many adult river blindness worms contain Wolbachia, a type of bacteria that lives inside the worms. So if the worms aren't bad enough, they also have this Wolbachia bacteria. The worms depend on these bacteria to survive and reproduce. Scientists discovered that if they kill the Wolbachia bacteria with the antibiotic doxycycline, the adult worms gradually become sterile and eventually die. So today, there are two different treatment approaches. Ivermectin rapidly kills the baby worms, reducing symptoms and transmission. Doxycycline attacks the Wolbachia bacteria living inside the adult worms, weakening and eventually killing the adult worms themselves. But here again, the adult worms live on for years and years and years. So the Onchovaria vulvaris is the parasite that causes river blindness. Microflaria is the baby worms that cause most of the symptoms. Ivermectin kills the baby worms. Wolbachia is the bacteria living inside the adult worms that helps them to survive. Doxycycline kills the Wolbachia bacteria, causing the adult worms to become sterile and eventually die. Loa Loa is a separate parasite that can create rare but serious complications if a person has extremely heavy infection when treated with ivermectin. These are the four key pieces that explain why river blindness treatment has evolved over the past 4 decades. River blindness is spread by black flies that breed in fast-flowing rivers. Loa Loa, the African eyeworm, is spread by deer flies, also called mango flies or crypto flies, not black flies. So, in parts of Africa, people can be bitten by both kinds of flies and become infected with both parasites. I gotta tell you, just getting to this point, unwrangling to this point, took me an incredible amount of time. If you think you log on to AI and ask a question, you get all the answers, you are madly, and badly misinformed. This stuff just ekes into the picture as you go rolling along. So, yeah, that is the whole picture right there. And it took me an incredible amount of time to get to that point. The problem with AI is they want to spin you backwards. They'll give you some real information, but then they'll give you hundreds and hundreds of pages of advice. Well, you can't say it this way. Don't say it that way. And they come up with all these conclusions that you never asked about. And I'll say, hey, wait a minute, stick to my question, stop with the advice. Oh, okay, yeah, I guess I did do that. Yeah, of course you did do that. AI is a gatekeeper. Beware when you go look for yourself. You only get an answer when you pound the daylights out of these people because, yes, it's all recorded because AI has copied all these documents and stuff. So I know it's buried there, but it's a matter of it takes an excessive amount of effort to drag it out of these groups. So the main countries for having both of these, and this is where it gets very interesting. So who has both kinds of flies and who becomes infected with both parasites? Well, Cameroon, one of the best studied countries for Loa Loa. Democratic Republic of the Congo. Extensive overlap of Loa Loa and river blindness in some regions. Republic of the Congo. Central African Republic, Gabon, Equatorial Guinea, parts of Angola, especially the north, parts of Chad, mainly the southern forested areas, parts of Nigeria, particularly southern states. So, by contrast, many other countries have received millions of ivermectin treatments, such as Uganda, Tanzania, Kenya, Ethiopia, Mali, Senegal, Ghana, Burkina Faso, and much of West Africa, and they have little or no Loa Loa. Why is that? Well, I can see why they want to keep the Congo locked up, right? Because they got to keep the war in the Congo going so they can be extracting the minerals, right? So they also claim that most African countries receiving ivermectin did not have a significant Loa Loa problem. The rare neurological complications were concentrated in parts of Central Africa, where many people were infected with both river blindness and high levels of Loa Loa. So, ivermectin is highly effective at killing the larvae stage of the river blindness parasite. It also kills Loa Loa bugs. In people carrying high numbers of Loa Loa, those larvae can die very rapidly after ivermectin treatment. That sudden die-off can trigger severe inflammation, and in rare cases, brain injury, coma, or death. Well, I don't know how rare any of this is, but I do need to take a break right now. So I will certainly be back on the other side because I'm going to be digging right into where this stuff all got started and how they came up with all of these deals that, I don't know. Obviously, I was able to put it into this file in some sort of order, right? But in my brain, it's still really not in order. None of these things really are adding up in my brain. But let me take a break here and come back on the other side.
Our goal is your satisfaction. Let us show you the way.
Why is ivermectin toxic to dogs? But dogs genetically sensitive to the medication have an anomaly that allows the ivermectin to pass the dog's blood-brain barrier and into its central nervous system, which can be lethal for the animal. The low dose used for commercial heartworm prevention is well below the toxic dose, even for the most sensitive dogs. What if my dog eats ivermectin? There is no treatment for the poisoning. Supportive measures are the only care available, though in cases of oral administration induction of vomiting and administration of activated charcoal often occur. Early and aggressive supportive care allows for a good prognosis for recovery.
Take our lead. Let's help you make your mark.
Okay, in the last segment I was talking about the brain barrier. Ivermectin is, in fact, capable of crossing, they say, to some extent, in both species, the brain barrier. So let's take a look at some of these studies. Well, Merck, and I'll get more into a lot of this later, but Merck was broken up. It was a German company broken up. The U.S. took part of it. And the U.S., being the charitable people they are, ivermectin for Africa, let's all in. Yeah, so that's how it got behind it. But let's talk about these studies. Merck themselves conducted much of the early development and clinical testing for ivermectin in both veterinary and human medicine. For example, in veterinary use, Merck developed ivermectin from the avermectins discovered by Satoshi Amura and William Campbell. And William Campbell conducted preclinical and clinical studies and brought products like Ivomec, which is for livestock, and HeartGuard for dogs to market after regulatory approval. Oh, kind of pushed it on through, right? So for human use, Merck also sponsored and conducted many of the early studies that led to approval for treating river blindness, working with academic researchers, clinicians in endemic countries, and regulatory agencies. That early work established dosing, pharmacokinetics, how the drug moves through the body, efficiency, common side effects, and safety profiles for the approved indications. Because those fundamental studies had already been completed, later researchers did not have to start from scratch when investigating ivermectin for new indications. They could build on an existing body of toxicology, pharmacology, manufacturing, and safety data. However, they still needed to conduct new studies appropriate to the new disease or use existing safety data. So it's fair to say that Merck's early development program created a substantial scientific and regulatory foundation that later investigators could build on. Merck did the heavy lifting in the early years. The company funded and carried out much of the original research needed to bring ivermectin to market, creating a large body of data on how the drug works, how it dosed, and its safety profile. Later investigations studying ivermectin for other conditions were able to build on this, and I guess that all of them just happen to miss a few details, right? Ivermectin is used in most countries, but not all countries use it the same way or the same scale. Dogs and heartworm medicine. Yeah, I would avoid watching any short clips on social media about dogs and ivermectin. Very dreadful to watch. But anyway, so in veterinary use, ivermectin is licensed for livestock and companion animals in most countries. It is widely used in cattle, sheep, goats, horses, pigs, dogs, and some other animals to control parasites. For humans, many countries have approved human ivermectin for specific parasitic diseases such as river blindness, strong labiosis, scabies in many countries, some other parasitic infections depending on national regulations. Mass Drug Administration, or MDA. So, countries with endemic river blindness or lymphatic filariasis have participated in large-scale ivermectin distribution programs. These have included many countries, much of sub-Saharan Africa, Yemen, parts of Latin America, including Mexico, Guatemala, Colombia, Ecuador, Venezuela, and Brazil. By contrast, the United States does not conduct nationwide ivermectin distribution campaigns because river blindness is not endemic here. Most European countries use ivermectin for individual prescriptions rather than public health campaigns. Countries where the largest tropical diseases do not occur generally use ivermectin only when a patient has a specific parasitic infection. One interesting aspect is this: the largest human use of ivermectin has not been in wealthy countries. The overwhelming majority of more than 5 billion donated human treatments since 1987 have been distributed through mass drug administration programs in Africa, with additional campaigns in Yemen and formerly endemic regions of Latin America. River blindness. In the mid-1980s, Merck and Company discovered the drug ivermectin, capable of combating the parasite that causes river blindness. At the time, the World Health Organization and the World Bank were conducting a campaign against the vector-borne disease in West Africa. And ivermectin was the most important drug in their arsenal. So you notice the players here. We got the World Health Organization. We have the World Bank involved, right? And the USA, of course, is, I would say they're leading the charge because they now own Merck and Company, right? But the newly discovered drug was too expensive for those patients or their governments. And a man at Merck, you'll want to pay attention to, a Dr. Vagelos, Vagelos. He was a true humanitarian. He wanted to see the drugs widely used. So he influenced Merck and Company to make needed quantities of the drug available to these governments and patients at no cost to them for the treatment of river blindness. Over 2 decades, beginning in 1986, the drug reached more than 55 million people. As it turns out, ivermectin is still at the center of what is widely considered the largest mass drug administration program ever undertaken. This is a huge deal. Billions of treatments over 38 years have been distributed across Africa through a partnership involving Merck, the World Health Organization, the World Bank, governments, and many international organizations. What also caught my attention is that ivermectin shares something in common with cyclosporin. Both have presented scientists with unusual laboratory challenges that slowed research for years. If it was the intentional infection of people with a river blindness parasite to cause disease, it would be called a biological attack. I am going on record. I consider ivermectin to be 100% a biological attack on Africa, Yemen, and those parts of South America. So, full disclosure, I am a rabid anti-ivermectin person. For example, if I were to meet someone and then I found out they were part of the people pushing ivermectin during COVID, they would have really get the side eye from me. If they said it was a mistake to never mention the side effects, I would listen. Otherwise, I am a hard liner on this subject. This ivermectin story had me started over years ago when I looked into river blindness and the Carters in Africa. It never left me. And it was all that one day that I was looking at the Carter Foundation and I saw that bottle of worms and those blind statues on Jimmy Carter's desk and in his office space. What I didn't connect at the time was how and why ivermectin, this drug, makes my hair catch on fire already. And now knowing the rest, you have to excuse me. I am a bit on the edge over all of this. How many people in Africa were harmed by ivermectin overall? I see it as a trick. The same characters. They came up with this helpful drug in Japan. Then it goes to the Carter Group doing work in Africa, the WHO, the World Bank, and someone I will say openly, I have so much hate for that I can barely speak. You have never heard me say, I hate this person or I hate that. I took it out of my language, as I recall, in the 90s. But I will go on record today and say the hatred I have for Robert McNamara, who was head of the World Bank, that pushed this ivermectin deal on Africa. He was the same guy from Vietnam, a major architect. So as they say, well, lots of people think he was problematic, but many see his role after Vietnam and his founding role at World Bank as a redeeming factor in his life. If you grew up in my generation, you would know the language I'm speaking. No one liked Robert McNamara. No one trusted him. He was behind all the horrors in the Vietnam War. He did not redeem himself. He went on with help of the World Bank to harm more. Robert McNamara is a complete psychopath, but he's America's psychopath, right? So right after all the destruction he did in Vietnam, he went on to run the World Bank, and he was the one that put ivermectin on the path. I have a lot of issues with McNamara. I have a cousin, a very sweet cousin. He's dead now. He was part of McNamara's morons. I never understood how my cousin got drafted in Vietnam. Never could understand it. He came back so fucking disabled he could barely function. He was hooked on heroin and all kinds of things. He was a trauma kid. He was a poster child for family trauma. That kid had everything wrong going on in his life. He was about my age. He got drafted into Vietnam because McNamara came up with this plan. They called them McNamara's morons. They recruited people like my cousin who clearly could not function well, and they sent them off to Vietnam to fight. That's why I keep saying, you've got to hear me on this. We're looking at a kill box. A kill box is normally a predefined area on a battlefield where military forces are authorized to attack approved enemy targets without asking for permission each time, as long as they follow the rules of engagement. So why use a kill box? In short, a kill box is a pre-approved combat zone where attacks on lawful military targets can be carried out more quickly. Are we allowing the entire world to become a kill box, where governments can identify, track, and strike people anywhere with little public oversight? Why is Yemen in this picture? The real geographic outliers appear to be Yemen and the isolated rainforest populations. Most of the other cases seem to fall within a more connected African disease belt or treatment network, while those two sit outside the main pattern and therefore deserve separate explanations. Yemen. They've been, ever since Obama, the black guy who turned on the rest of the black world, Obama did a deal with the Saudis to go after Yemen. Is it because of their historical things there? I don't know. Yemen has always been a soft spot with me. Yemen, McNamara will drive me to tears every time. Yemen could reflect historical movement across the Red Sea. And remember, Yemen was part of the magic carpet. They booted a whole lot of children out of Yemen to populate Israel. So they also got this rainforest group and claimed that they had this disease, the river blindness. So how did Yemen and this rainforest group, they may represent long isolation, because why did these two groups all of a sudden get these diseases, right? There's a group called the Yanomami. They live in the Amazon rainforest along the Brazil-Venezuela border. There have been documented cases of river blindness among Yanomami communities, particularly those living near fast-flowing rivers where infected black flies, pay attention to those black flies, breed. Their remote location made it difficult for health workers to reach everyone consistently. And you got to tell me, do you find anything suspicious about the Yanomami getting this disease? Let me keep reading here. The Yanomami are one of the few indigenous populations in the Americas where river blindness became established. Transmission occurs through repeated bites from infected black flies, not person to person. The disease has caused severe itching, skin disease, and vision problems in affected communities. International efforts led by Ministries of Health, the Pan American Health Organization, who and partners have brought repeated ivermectin treatment to many Yanomami villages over the past few decades. The Yanomami are an interesting outlier because river blindness in the Americas was geographically limited compared with Africa. Most transmissions occurred in small, isolated places in countries such as Brazil, Venezuela, Mexico, Guatemala, Ecuador, and Colombia. Among these, the Yanomami region was one of the most remote and challenging area for elimination efforts. So there's two outliers in this: the Yanomami region in the Amazon, conveniently enough, and the Yemen people on the Arabian Peninsula. What is striking is that they're far from the original belt of endemic transmission across sub-Sahara Africa. Researchers have a strong hypothesis, but they have been not able to identify exactly when or how many times river blindness became established in Yemen. The leading explanation is that the parasite reached Yemen through ancient movement of people across the Red Sea between East Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. Those connections go back thousands of years through trade, migration, and travel. Once infected people arrived in western Yemen, local black flies breeded in fast-growing valleys, and they could have picked up the parasite and started local transmission. I call BS. I don't think this was ancient at all. A few details about Yemen make it unusual. The disease is found mainly in western Yemen, especially valleys that drain toward the Red Sea, not throughout the entire country. In Yemen, river blindness is usually called Sauda, S-O-W-D-A, or blackness, because the patients often describe severe darkened skin and intense itching rather than the classic blindness seen in many. African endemic areas, blindness has historically been much less common there. It was first described in the medical literature in the 1940s, but local people have recognized the condition long before that. So why hasn't anyone pinned down its origin? Because there are no written records saying the disease arrived in year X. Researchers instead rely on parasite genetics, black fly genetics, archaeology, historical trade routes, and epidemiology. Those methods can suggest that the Yemeni parasite population is closely related to East African strains, but they cannot yet reconstruct the exact historical event that introduced it. Yemen is a genuine geographic outlier. It sits outside the main African endemic belt, yet just across the Red Sea from the Horn of Africa. This has made it an important location for studying how river blindness spreads historically. The current evidence favors an ancient introduction through long-standing human movement across the Red Sea, but the exact timing and circumstances remain unresolved. Gee, I wonder why that is. But this is actually one of the biggest unanswered questions in the history of river blindness of the Americas. Researchers are confident that river blindness was introduced into the Americas from West Africa during the transatlantic slave trade, beginning in the 1500s. Most of the known endemic foci in Latin America occurred in areas with documented slave populations, such as parts of Mexico, Guatemala, Colombia, Ecuador, and Venezuela. But the Yanomami focus doesn't fit that pattern. The Yanomami, which is spelled Y-A-N-O-M-A-M-I, live in an extremely remote region of the Brazil-Venezuela border that was not part of the major colonial plantation economy. It was not a major slave trade destination, and it has remained geographically isolated for centuries. Because of that, researchers have proposed two main hypotheses: that an ancient introduction was followed by migration, or the spread from northern Venezuela through indigenous movements. So, yeah, those are what they're saying, right? Researchers emphasize they do not know which hypothesis is correct, and there is not enough historical evidence to reconstruct the exact route. That uncertainty is one reason the Yanomami focus has attracted so much scientific interest. And here's where you need to pay attention. Today, it is also the last remaining endemic focus in the Americas, spanning the Brazil-Venezuela border, after elimination was achieved in Colombia, Ecuador, Mexico, and Guatemala. So, the people in Yemen, how did river blindness cross the Red Sea and become established there? The Yanomami region, how did river blindness reach such an isolated Amazonian population? Well, I will have to try to explain it to you. They've tried to compare all these things. They've done all that. It does not look, and this is very important, okay, because I believe it's the same specimen from Africa, right? That probably got, well, I don't know, placed there, released there, part of the deal there. So it does not look like a newly emerged species that suddenly appeared in the Americas. It does not look like a genetically distinct strain that would suggest a recent separate origin. It is consistent with a parasite that had already been circulating in Africa for a long time before reaching the Americas, which leaves the historical questions like when did it arrive? How many introductions occurred? Exactly how did it reach those remote areas? So let's start talking a little bit about Japan. From Imperial Army microbiology to ivermectin, if you will recall when I spoke about Unit 731 in the past recently, when Unit 731 was discovered, there was a deal made. The United States would take all of their knowledge, and that would also leave the royal family in Japan on the throne. So that meant that nothing changed, right? 731 existed. A lot of those people have royal and elite connections. A lot of those people spread out. They changed jobs. They did a lot of things to hide these people. So I went piece by piece to figure out, does this ivermectin go further than the guy in Japan in his past into the Unit 731? I have to ask these questions, right? A number of senior figures in Japan's wartime military and scientific establishment came from elite, educational, military, bureaucratic, or aristocratic backgrounds. Imperial Japan's officer corps and senior civil service were closely tied to prestigious universities, such as the Tokyo Imperial University, and some senior military families had noble connections. When people tell the story of ivermectin, it usually starts in the 1970s with a Japanese scientist named Satsushi Omura, O-M-U-R-A. I'll just be calling him Omura from here on out. So Omura was collecting soil samples around Japan. One of those samples contained a previously unknown microorganism. Years later, scientists at the American pharmaceutical company Merck discovered that the compounds produced by that microorganism were remarkably effective against parasitic worms. Merck refined one of those compounds into the drug we now call ivermectin. That story is true. It just isn't the whole story. The question that interests me wasn't how Asumura I gotta get these names straight. The question that interests me wasn't how Omura found a microorganism in the soil. It was something much simpler. Who taught him to think that way? Scientists don't wake up one morning and invent an entirely new field. They inherit ideas, methods, and mentors from the generations before them. Once I started following those mentors, the story became much more interesting because as I picked up the story, Omura would have been 10 years old when this all took place. So he came along afterwards, right? So it led me to one place over and over again, the Kitasoto Institute in Japan. The institute was founded by Dr. Shabi Kitasato, Kitasato, one of the pioneers of modern bacteriology. Long before antibiotics, long before ivermectin, and long before the Second World War, Kitasato built one of Japan's leading centers for studying bacteria, infectious disease, quarantine, and epidemic control. He wasn't just running experiments, he was training the next generation. One of the brightest young scientists to emerge from that world was Dr. Hata, H-A-T-A. If you've never heard the name, you're not alone. But around 1909, he helped develop one of the first successful drugs against syphilis while working with the German scientist Paul Ehrlich. At a time when infectious diseases killed millions of people, this was considered a major medical breakthrough. Hatta also had experience in military medicine and worked in South Manchuria during the Second World War. Eventually, he became director of the Kitasato Institute. Now we come to the person who really caught my attention. There's another Hatta. It's called Toju Hatta. The names are similar because they are family. Toju was born into another family, but was later adopted by Satohiro Hatta and became his heir. He inherited not only the Hatta name, but also entered the same scientific world. So in 1936, Tojo Hatta joined the Kitasato Institute as a young microbiologist. 1 year later, history interrupted his career. Japan extended its war in China, and Tojo Hatta was drafted into the Imperial Japanese Army. He was sent to Manchuria. That single sentence appears in every biography of his, that he served in Manchuria. But that's where the story becomes strangely vague. The biographies don't tell us his military unit. They don't identify the laboratory where he worked. They don't name his commanding officer. They don't explain his assignment. They simply say he served in Manchuria. Then they jump to 1938 when he was transferred to the Ninoshima Army Quarantine Station near Hiroshima. Ninoshima wasn't an ordinary army base. It was where returning soldiers were examined for infectious diseases, quarantined when necessary, disinfected, and processed before returning to Japan. That meant Tojo Hatta wasn't serving as an infantry officer or an administrator. He was working as a microbiologist inside Japan's military system for infectious disease, quarantine, and epidemic control, and that's what caught my attention. Not that it proves anything by itself, because it places him inside a very specific scientific and military world. After the war, Tojo Hatta returned to the Kitasato Institute. He didn't leave science behind. In fact, he became one of Japan's leading researchers searching for medicines produced by microorganisms. His laboratories worked on antibiotics and other compounds found in bacteria growing naturally in the soil. Eventually, Hatta became the director of the Kitasato Institute. Then in 1965, a young scientist named Omura arrived. You know, the guy that was only 10 when this all got started. So Omura enters the picture in 1965 at the Kitasato Institute. This is the connection most historians skip over. Omura did not build his laboratory from scratch. He entered Hatta's laboratory world. The two men worked together. They published research together. They were both searching soil microorganisms for useful medicines. That eventually search led Omura to a microorganism that produced the natural compounds called Ivermectin. Those compounds were sent to Merck in the United States. There, parasitologist William Campbell recognized something extraordinary. By Jove, we've got something here. Those compounds were exceptionally effective against parasitic worms. Merck's chemists modified one of the natural compounds to improve it. The result became ivermectin. When I look at this history, what stands out isn't one discovery, it's the continuity. One scientific generation trained the next. And also, that area in Manchuria was exactly where Unit 731 was built. But they will never mention that part, right? And running through the middle of that story is Hatta, a scientist whose career crossed wartime military medicine, post-war antibiotic research, and the laboratory where Amura began the work that eventually led to ivermectin. So, the clearest elite connection tied directly to the Kitasato Institute are these. Kitasato himself became one of Japan's titled elite. In 1924, he was made a baron under Japan's hereditary peerage system. He was also a member of the Imperial Academy and received high imperial decorations. So by the latter part of his life, Kitasato was not merely a scientist working outside the establishment, he had formally elevated into it. So, there was this place called, these people called I'm going to keep this very simple here, the Fujiwan. They founded Keio University and was one of the most influential intellectual and institutional figures in modern Japan. And this person helped Kitasato establish Japan's first private infectious disease institute and supported the tuberculosis hospital on the site where later Kitasato Institute was built. Kitasato later repaid that support by helping establish Keio's medical school. I have all these also written down below. So, yeah, and then we have this other person that supplied the industrial wealth. This other person was a major businessman who built an industrial and trade empire and later included companies associated with all this group. Official history state that he officially supported Kitasato's Infectious Disease Institute in 1892 and made major donations to Kitasato and other elite educational institutes. The Home Ministry and senior government medical officials were directly involved also. Kitasato Institute worked with the Home Military Sanitary Affairs Bureau after medical school. His early institute was supported through the efforts of senior public health officials and other politicians. The institute was later nationalized, showing that Kitasato's work was connected from the beginning to the upper levels of Japan's public health administration. There was also a strong connection to Keio University, that's Keio, one of Japan's most prestigious private institutions. Hatta, the senior Hatta, not the young Hatta, the one that got adopted, trained within the Kitasato network and had studied at the same elite intersection of bacteriology, government medicine, and international research. Hatta later inherited both the Hatta name and that institutional position. So yeah, all of them connect, right? It shows that the Kitasato Institute was built from the beginning through a compact alliance of government medicine, wealthy industrial patrons, prestigious education, and the imperial honor system. That is the elite network directly attached to the place that we're tracking right now. So, George W. Merck established the philosophy. Max Tischer built the Japan-Merck partnership. William Campbell recognized the drug's potential. And a person named Mohammed Aziz, A-Z-I-Z, proved it worked on humans. And then Roy Vagelos, V-A-G-E-L-O-S, ensured that it reached millions of people through the donation program. Funny how it all worked out, right? So, Kitasato became one of Japan's titled elites. He became that baron. So yeah, the top of this chain definitely is from money, elites, and military. So yeah, I'm not going to bore you with every detail here, but yeah, they all connect. And let's talk about this Dr. Aziz, A-Z-I-Z, often published as M.A. Aziz, was one of the pivotal physician scientists who helped move ivermectin from a promising veterinary drug into a treatment for humans with river blindness. This is his role in the story. He worked at Merck Sharp and this other research lab in New Jersey. where he focused on tropical medicine and anti-parasitic drug development. He led the first human clinical trials of ivermectin for river blindness in Senegal. In 1982, he and colleagues published the landmark Lancet paper. The trial showed that a single oral dose dramatically reduced the microflora, the baby worms responsible for blindness and skin disease, and was generally well tolerated. He continued participation in larger clinical trials in Africa, including Liberia and Ghana, comparing ivermectin with the older drug, or DEC. Those studies he did demonstrated that ivermectin was both safer and more effective for mass treatments. Aziz also authored influential reviews explaining why ivermectin made large-scale treatment campaigns possible because a single annual dose could suppress transmission. So the idea was this: they could just roll into Africa a few times a year, hand out these doses, and everything's fine, right? But the part that still puzzles me is they were only killing the baby parasites, right? Nothing was developed to kill the real root of the problem, right? So, yeah. So if we think of this in stages, we really have three players here. We have Omura. He isolated the bacteria that produced the compounds. We have William C. Campbell. He was at Merck and identified and developed the avermectin compound into ivermectin. Mohammed Aziz led the critical early human studies showing ivermectin worked safely against river blindness, paving the way for regulatory approval and essentially the donation program. Given the direction, Dr. Aziz is an important figure because he sits at the transition point between Merck's lab work and the mass human treatment programs in Africa. The period in the United States is much more significant. So yes, Omura did study abroad, but really they all seem to really connect, right? So I'm not going to be going through all these timelines. I have every one of them down below. I have the timelines from when Omura comes into the picture. But in 1971 was what they're calling the American turning point. And this is for Omura. Feeling uncertain about the direction of his research, Omura received advice from colleagues to spend time overseas. Isn't that just so convenient, right? He's feeling a little bit burnt out, so people say, Omura, go to the United States. Professor Yagasawi helps arrange introduction throughout North America. Omura contacts several universities in Canada and the United States and receives multiple offers. Instead of accepting the highest paid position, Omura chooses the lowest paying offer because he believes there must be something unique about it. That offer comes from Professor Max Tischer, Tishler, at Wesleyan University in Connecticut. Max Tischer was not an ordinary university professor. Before joining Wesleyan, he had been executive vice president for research, director of research laboratories, and one of the principal science leaders at Merck. Excuse me, I couldn't make this up. I spent the next 100 years, right? So Omura ends up under Max Tischer, right? Gee, what a coincidence, right? When Omura first arrived, Tischer was becoming president of the American Chemical Society, leaving him little time for daily laboratory supervision. According to Omura's own recollections, Tischer largely entrusted him with overseeing much of the laboratory while introducing him to a steady stream of internationally known chemists and industrial researchers. That experience exposed Omura to something uncommon in Japan at the time, the university-industry collaboration. Rather than viewing academic research and pharmaceutical companies as separate worlds, Tischer showed how universities and industry could work together to move discoveries from laboratory benches into medicines. that concept would fundamentally shape Amura's career. While at Wesleyan, Amura also collaborated with Nobel laureate Conrad Bloch of Harvard University. Together, they published work involving this thing called beryllium, and that was expanding Amura's international scientific reputation. Omura had originally expected to remain for approximately 3 years, but instead, after only 14 months, the Kitasato Institute recalled him to Japan following the retirement of a senior director so that he could assume greater leadership responsibilities. I find this whole trip just fascinating, right? Just wanders over to America, happens to land a big position with a big guy. So before returning to Japan, Omura also visited the National Institute of Health, several American pharmaceutical companies. His goal was not to seek employment. Instead, he proposed an entirely new research model. Kitasato would discover promising microorganisms and natural compounds. An American pharmaceutical company would perform animal testing, development, manufacturing, and commercialization. Royalties would return to support further scientific research at Kitasato. This proposal was unusual for the early 1970s and reflected what he had learned during his time in the United States. So, through Max Tischler's introductions and support, Merck agreed to collaborate. The partnership divided responsibilities, almost like a glove, if you ask me. Kitasato Institute would collect thousands of soil samples, isolate microorganisms, identify promising natural products, perform laboratory screening, and Merck would do the animal testing, chemistry, development, manufacturing, regulatory work, and worldwide commercialization. This collaboration became one of the best-known public-private research partnerships in pharmaceutical history. So, while working within this framework, Omura's group isolated Streptococcus, which is Ivermectin, from a Japanese soil sample. Merck scientist William C. Campbell and colleagues demonstrated that compounds from this microorganism possess extraordinary parasitic activity. The resulting drug family became known as ivermectins, later chemically modified into ivermectin. If you look back at the 1971 to 1972, the period that Omura was over at that university, it was more than an overseas fellowship trip. It was the point at which Omura moved from being a highly skilled Japanese natural products chemist to becoming part of an international network linking Japanese academic microbiology, which I would argue they came from Unit 731, American university chemistry, and U.S. pharmaceutical industry, and eventually Merck's anti-parasitic drug program. Without that period under Max Tischler, the Kitasato-Merck collaboration that led to ivermectin almost certainly would have taken a very different path, or might not have formed at all. So, yeah, because it all happened so quickly, right? 1973, Omura of the Kitasato Institute collects soil samples. 1974, Omura sends the most promising bacterial cultures to Merck Research Laboratories in New Jersey. Merck parasitologist Dr. William C. Campbell begins testing the organisms against parasitic worms affecting livestock. 1975, Merck scientists isolate a family of natural compounds produced by the bacterium, also name them ivermectins. The compounds proved extraordinarily effective against many parasitic worms. 1978 to 79, Merck chemically modifies ivermectin to produce a safer, more potent compound for practical use. The new drug is named ivermectin. 1981, ivermectin is introduced worldwide as a veterinary medicine. It quickly becomes one of the most successful anti-parasitic drugs ever developed for cattle, horses, sheep, pigs, and companion animals. 1981 to 1986, human clinical trials began for river blindness in Africa. Researchers discover, what a discovery they made! Ivermectin dramatically reduces the number of baby worms that cause severe itching, skin disease, and blindness. Scientists also discover an important limitation. Ivermectin kills the baby worms, but does not usually kill the long-lived adult worms. Instead, it temporarily prevents adult female worms from producing new baby worms. 1987, Merck receives approval for the human form of ivermectin under the brand name Mezatiz, M-E-C-T-I-Z-A-N. Merck CEO Dr. Roy Vagelos announces the Mezatiz donation program. As much as needed for as long as needed, he declared. Merck agrees to donate ivermectin free of charge for river blindness control. This becomes one of the largest humanitarian drug donation programs in history. I think it was a pretty slick move, if you ask me. They knew they couldn't afford it, right? Hey, give it to them for free. They'll take it. I'll keep reading. The late 1980s, mass treatment programs began across Africa. Communities receive ivermectin once or twice per year. Because the adult worms live approximately 10 to 15 years, treatment must continue year after year after year until the adult worms naturally die. And that was the late 1980s. So the early 1990s, programs expand rapidly across sub-Saharan Africa. Researchers observe enormous reduction in severe itching, skin disease, blindness, transmission of river blindness. Mid-1990s, doctors working in parts of Central Africa began reporting a rare but serious problem. Some patients become severely ill shortly after taking ivermectin. Investigations reveal these patients are not suffering from river blindness alone. Instead, they're also carrying a very high number of another parasite called loa loa, or the African eyeworm. So then 1995 to 2000, scientists determined the neurological complications are associated with people who have extremely high loa loa loads. The evidence indicates the complications are primarily related to the rapid death of massive numbers of loa loa after treatment, rather than ivermectin crossing into and damaging the human brain under normal dosing. It looks to me like they did a lot of looking around and nobody seemed to want to look at those pills, right? Or maybe I'm just reading this wrong. Or maybe, I am kind of crazy, right? Everybody has called me crazy for all these years. Hey, they could be right? This could be a further way for the world to say, yes, we knew she was crazy all along. Look what she said about Africa. Yeah. Funny thing, I'm one of the few people standing up for Africa. These other people seem to be going after Africa, right? So to always keep your people in line with what they're actually doing, right? My goal is to expose the truth about Africa. Their goal seems to me to be wanting to, I don't know, maybe make Africa their latest kill box, right? I have to ask these questions, right? So this complication is found almost entirely in regions where loa loa and river blindness overlap. Just a miracle how that happened, right? Late 1990s to 2000, public health programs adapt. Health workers begin mapping loa loa regions, screening high-risk communities, modifying treatment strategies where necessary. Mass ivermectin programs continue safely in most endemic regions. So in the 2000s, the Mezatiz donation program expands beyond river blindness to support efforts against lymphatic filariasis. In many countries throughout through combining drug programs. So yeah, they cooked up another one. And this one, I'm a little fuzzy on it, but 2010, several countries in Latin America eliminate river blindness transmission. I don't know how Latin America even got it in the first place, okay? Large parts of Africa also make major progress toward elimination. So by the 2010s, more than 3 billion ivermectin treatments have been distributed. And in 2015, Almura gets the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine and is awarded jointly. Dr. Omura from Japan and Dr. William C. Campbell from Merck, USA, both share the Nobel Prize. Do you see any red flags here? I think people have become very adept at painting red flags white, right? They see a red flag flying and they move in to say, that couldn't be. That guy was really a nice guy. You got this wrong. Well, I don't think any of this is nothing they're doing is right, and all of it in my mind is wrong. So let me keep with this little timeline here. 2015, they got the Nobel Peace Prize. Big deal, right? 2020 to 2022. Ivermectin becomes the subject of worldwide controversy during the COVID-19 pandemic, generating intense scientific, medical, and political debate far beyond its original role as an anti-parasitic medicine. 2023 to 2026, up until today, the donation program still continues. More than 5 billion treatments have now been donated worldwide. River blindness has been eliminated or maybe interrupted in several countries, while many African nations continue annual treatment campaigns. Research continues studying new approaches, including doxycycline, which targets the Wallabachi bacteria living inside adult river blindness worms, in hopes of shortening treatment times and eventually eliminating the disease. Researchers have proposed several overlapping mechanisms that lead to the neuro issues. Rather than a single accepted mechanism, researchers have proposed several that may act together in the rare cases of post-ivermectin encephalopathy associated with very high loa loads. They claim that paralyzed or dying little baby bugs or worms may clog tiny blood vessels. Ivermectin rapidly mobilizes and clears them. With an extreme parasite burden, masses of affected loa little worms may obstruct cerebral capillaries, causing poor circulation, small hemorrhages, and damage to the blood-brain barrier. So they claim these things may, and the word is may, okay, may pass into brain tissue or cerebral fluid. Studies and case reports have detected them in fluid after treatment. So inflammation probably contributes. The immune system may react to damaged parasites and release parasite material, worsening swelling and vascular injury. However, it has not been proven that a generalized inflammatory reaction alone explains the problems. Direct ivermectin neurotoxicity has been considered. At the standard dose, ivermectin ordinarily penetrates the human brain poorly. Nevertheless, researchers have questioned whether a damaged blood-brain barrier, unusual drug transport, concurrent malaria, or other illnesses could allow more ivermectin into the cerebral nervous system. That possibility has not been completely eliminated in individual cases. A 2017 experimental paper stated that the pathogenesis of these serious reactions had not previously been investigated experimentally. Much of the accepted explanation, therefore, came from clinical timing, parasite counts, cerebral fluid examinations, pathology, and autopsy findings, not from a controlled experiment deliberately reproducing this in humans. You see where the problems start to lie, right? High Loa density is a proven major risk factor. Well, they say, well, it's proven. It's got to be Loa. Rapid ivermectin-induced paralysis or clearance of those parasites is strongly implicated. However, whether the final brain injury is caused mainly by capillary obstruction, parasite migration, vascular inflammation, blood-brain barrier disruption, direct drug exposure, or a combination remains incompletely resolved. I would think one would have resolved all those issues before handing out pills, right? Ivermectin rapidly paralyzes and clears Loa from the bloodstreams. When someone has an exceptionally high parasitic burden, enormous numbers of these worms are affected within a short time. Researchers believe this rapid change initiates the cascade leading to neurological complications. One hypothesis is that a very large number of immobilized or damaged worms accumulate in the smallest blood vessels, particularly in the brain. And this could reduce local blood flows, damage vessel walls, contribute to swelling or tiny hemorrhages. Autopsy findings have shown these are associated with damaged cerebral vessels, lending support to this mechanism. Normally, the blood-brain barrier prevents both parasites and most ivermectin from entering the brain. Researchers have suggested that severe vascular injury or inflammation may temporarily disrupt the barrier. And if that occurs, it may enter the central nervous system. It may cause inflammatory cells and proteins may enter. And it may mean that more ivermectin than usual might reach brain tissue. As these things are damaged and cleared, parasitic compounds are released. The immune system reacts to this material. Researchers think this inflammatory response may be increased swelling, damaged blood vessels, worsened neurological injury. The degree to which inflammation alone causes a symptom is still debated today, 2026. Direct ivermectin effects on the brain. This has also been investigated. Normally, ivermectin is largely excluded from the brain by the blood-brain barrier and the P-glycoprotein transporters. Researchers have asked whether unusually high drug exposure, impaired blood-brain barrier function, or genetic differences in drug transport or other illnesses could allow ivermectin itself to contribute to neurological symptoms. At standard therapeutic doses, evidence suggests direct ivermectin toxicity is not considered the primary explanation for these rare Loa associated cases. Many tropical medicine experts now think no single mechanism can fully explain the syndrome. Instead, it may involve a sequence like this: extremely high Loa burden. Ivermectin rapidly paralyzes and clears this. Cerebral blood vessels become affected by the parasite's burden. The blood-brain barrier becomes compromised. Inflammation develops. Neurological symptoms emerge. So, that is what I would consider kind of a big guessing game. So, still under investigation. Which proposed mechanism is the initial trigger? The relative importance of vascular blockage, inflammation, blood-brain barrier disruption, and direct drug effects. Why only a small fraction of heavily infected individuals develop this thing while others with similarly high parasitic leads do not? So that leads to all the trials they started in Senegal, and that was with that Dr. Abi guy. They all joined in down there doing all these trains. So The very first published study included, pay attention to this, 32 single-use patients with river blindness. Instead of jumping to the full dose, they carefully escalated according to their weight. They observed that 5 and 10 kilometers had little effect. The others had greatly reduced the baby worms, and no serious adverse effects reported in that small study. Merck then conducted another study in Paris involving about 20 West African immigrants with river blindness. That study tested doses, helping establish the dose range that later became standard. Then came some larger trials, and yeah, they did do some larger trials. So in 1981, 32 patients in Senegal. Next, they did 20 patients in Paris. Mid-1980s, several controlled studies involving dozens to hundreds of patients. Before worldwide donation programs, approximately 120,000 people participated in large field trials in Liberia and other Western African countries under the River Blindness Control Program. Those studies found relatively few serious adverse events and helped establish annual dosing. One interesting point is that the researchers were very aware they were entering new territory. They started with extremely low doses and increased them only after reviewing the safety data. Dr. Mohammed Aziz is often credited with insisting on this cautious dose escalation strategy. Yeah, good old Dr. Aziz. Give that old boy a pat on that white coat back. So basically what we're looking at is hundreds and millions of things. I've got all the lists down below. The 1987 Merck Ivermectin program changed global pandemic health. Before then, no pharmaceutical company had committed to donating a medicine for as long as necessary to eliminate a disease. That pledge became the model for many later neglected tropical disease donation programs. Yeah, they all started pointing into Africa. Oh, we'll give you some drugs too. Come on, let us in. So in 1997, GlaxoSmithKline began donating this thing called albendazole. 1998, Pfizer begins donating another drug. 2005, Johnson & Johnson expands another drug donation. 2007, Merck emerges some other donation program. 2013, they start giving out something for something else. From a historical standpoint, the Ivermectin program is generally considered the first, or the root, and the largest of these global medicine donation efforts, and it became the template for many of the others that followed. The program brought together some of our favorite people. Merck donated the medicine. They committed in 1987 to provide it as much as needed for as long as needed. World Health Organization, who are you going to call? They developed treatment guidelines, coordinated technical strategy, and worked with ministries of health. The World Bank, they help finance and coordinate major river blindness control programs in Africa, particularly the River Blindness Control Program and the African Program for River Blindness. The Carters, Jimmy Carter, that Carter Center expanded community-directed treatment and supported elimination efforts in multiple countries. There was the National Institutes, Ministries of Health. They organized treatment campaigns within each country. There were community drug distributors, millions of local volunteers who carried tablets village to village, often on foot. Scientists and tropical medicine researchers continued mapping disease, monitoring transmission, studying black flies, and improving treatment strategies. NGOs, including Sightsavers, Helen Keller International, CBM, IBM, World Health, Lion Clubs, and many others that supplied staff, logistics, and training. One reason many health historians point to the Ivermectin program as a milestone is that it shows what can be accomplished when a country sets out to murder all the other residents of a black country. No, I made up that last part. So One reason many public health histories point to the ivermectin program as a milestone is that it showed what could be accomplished when a pharmaceutical company, international organization, governments, scientists, and local communities all committed to the same long-term goal. It became a model that later influenced medical donations for trachoma, lymphatic filariasis, intestinal worms, schizosomia, and other neglected tropical diseases. You started to pick the picture of that. Remember our old friend Ashford was also into tropical diseases, right? I think there's a little something with these tropical disease people, but hey, I'm not going to say anything that specific, right? They were probably all angels hiding in disguise in those white coats, right? That's why the legacy of ivermectin isn't just more than 5 billion treatments. It's also the public health infrastructure that grew around it. Networks of researchers, health workers, ministries, NGOs, and international agencies that continued working together on other neglected tropical diseases long after the first ivermectin tablets were distributed. One thing I came away with after researching this story was a deep appreciation for the scientists. I think they're a rather crafty lot, if you ask me. Behind the headlines about ivermectin are generations of researchers who dedicated decades of their lives to diseases that most of the world never thought about. They worked in remote villages, along rivers, in tropical laboratories, and in some of the most difficult environments on Earth. You got to hand it to those scientists, right? They're always there when you need them. Put on those white coats, get out into Africa. We need you over here in Africa. Their work made possible one of the largest humanitarian medical efforts in history. Alongside Merck, the World Health Organization, the World Bank, the Carter Center, ministries of health, NGOs, and millions of community volunteers, these scientists helped build a global network that has delivered more than 5 billion treatments and improved the lives of millions of people. Or I would say, well, they probably harm millions of people, right? Whether studying black flies, parasitic worms, diagnostics, or new treatments, their research became the foundation for programs that continue today. Whatever differences people may have about ivermectin and other contexts, its legacy in tropical medicine is inseparable from the dedication of the scientists who spent their careers trying to reduce human suffering. Or, as I would say, let the killing fields begin in Africa. We got a case, we're going to go over there, and we're going to kill them all. The story also brings back a familiar name, Dr. R.W. Ashford. As it turns out, these scientists who study cyclospora, river blindness, and many other tropical diseases often work in the same small world of tropical medicine, crossing paths to many of the same institutions and research programs. So yes, they started out and they were able to do all of this to Africa. Poor Africa. If I could help anybody, I would be on a plane to Africa. I would be going through that country with a bullhorn saying, "Stop taking the pills! Stop taking the pills! Red alert! Stop taking the pills! If you see a white person, run! If you see another white person, run faster! If you see a bunch of them in white coats, clear the area! Run as fast as you can! Beat them off the path!" So yes, that is a legacy for China. Excuse me, for Africa. So I got involved in Africa years ago because what I noticed was this. There was a particular base in Germany that expanded into Africa after World War II. My biggest fear was this. I thought they were maybe expanding the horror that went on during World War II into Africa and, let's say, a more easily hideable place, right? So I started looking at Africa in a completely different way because I had first done that show about how they split up Africa. And then I got re-engaged with Africa because early on, there were no reports about Africa. when I went to look, the base in Stuttgart, Germany, that expanded into Africa and eventually became AFRICOM, it was literally hidden for years. And I'm not just exaggerating here. It was hidden. When I first started looking, I could rarely find maybe somebody who might have a photo they took somewhere in Africa of one of these bases, okay, that expanded out of Germany. So because it was hidden, I kept my eyes on it over all this time, right? So, yeah. And I think it all started when I did that show about the Berlin Conference. Then I stumbled onto the U.S. military presence centered around Stuttgart, Germany, and its growing expansion into Africa. At the time, it wasn't getting much attention. Then that got me asking questions. Why Africa? Why the expansion? Those questions led me eventually to the history of river blindness, ivermectin, and the World Bank. So yeah, so I didn't start off by thinking, they're talking too much about ivermectin, I got to go check this out. No, I have a pretty long history with that. So was Africa being helped by the World Bank or abused in a new form of a eugenics tool? I have to ask, did science and medications given out for free over 38 years have an impact? I have to doubt that those millions of doses did not provide any real information or informed consent. They handed it out by giving local people, and I'll get into that more later, but basically what they did was they recruited local people to go village to village. So yeah, I have some very serious concerns about, did anybody really knowingly consent to any of this, right? So over roughly 38 years, from 1987 to today, the ivermectin donation program has become the largest mass drug administration campaign in history. Merck has donated more than 5 billion treatments. The campaign has reached hundreds of millions of people across Africa, Latin America, and Yemen. It has also involved partnerships with Merck, the World Health Organization, the World Bank, national governors, the Carter Center, and numerous local health workers and volunteers. Whatever one's views about ivermectin during the COVID era, its role in tropical medicine is extraordinary. By scale alone, no other donated medicine has been distributed in such numbers over such a long period for a single neglected tropical disease program. So let's talk about the sad story about these Yanomami people. I hope you'll listen up. The Yanomami people are still under attack right now. I'm the one saying they're under attack. The rest of the world is saying, hey, we're just helping them out. In 1967, Brazilian physicians examined a 3-year-old Yanomami child with 2 scalp nodules. When the nodules are surgically removed and examined, they identify the virus, the river virus, the parasitic worm that causes river blindness. This is the first recognized case in Brazil. In late 1960s to 1970s, the discovery prompts Brazilian researchers to investigate neighboring Yanomami villages along the Brazil-Venezuela border. Rather than finding an isolated case, they discover that river blindness is already established throughout a remote region of the Amazons. And believe me, it's not just any remote region of the Amazon. Entomologists identified local semi-Malaysian black flies capable of transmitting the parasite, confirming that an active transmission cycle exists. 1970s to the 80s, researchers continue mapping the endemic area, documenting infection to numerous Yanomami communities. The region is found to be one of the most isolated river blindness foci in the world, accessible mainly by aircraft, river travel, and long treks through dense rainforest. So, in 1987, when Merck announces the donation program, pledging to provide ivermectin free of charge for as long as needed, So then in 1990, Brazil begins regular ivermectin distributed among the Yanomami as part of the Pan-American Health Organization's Regional Elimination Program. 1992, Brazil officially recognizes the Yanomami indigenous territory, protecting approximately 3,700,000 square miles of rainforest. This extraordinary where these people live. The protected area improves access for organized. They find these people in one of the most preserved areas of the rainforest, okay? And they think, we found some problems here. So the 2000 to present, most endemic areas of the Americas eliminate river blindness through repeated ivermectin treatment. But the Yanomami region on the Brazil-Venezuela border remains the last endemic focus in the Americas, requiring continued treatment because of its vast size, scattered villages, and difficult terrain. So that is the story about that group over there. Just happens to be in that protected rainforest area, right? Yemen. Unlike most countries affected by river blindness, Yemen is the only country outside of Africa where the river blindness remains endemic. The disease in Yemen is known locally as Sowda, S-O-W-D-A, a severe inflammatory skin form of the infection. Unlike much of Africa, blindness has been uncommon in Yemen. The disease has primarily caused intense itching, skin damage, and disabilities. So how did it get over to Yemen? I don't really know. I have all the data down below. I'm not going to drag through every square inch of it, but I think that moving along here with Yemen, in 2019, nearly 500,000 Yemenis received ivermectin during a national campaign involving almost 1,000 treatment teams working across 33 endemic districts despite ongoing conflict. Yeah, you gotta think they're pretty serious, right? Bombs are flying everywhere, and these people are running around looking for people with river blindness, right? 2025, Yemen carries out its largest ever ivermectin campaigns, reaching remote mountains, communities that had previously been difficult to access because of conflict and geography. 2026, the elimination campaign continues. WHO describes Yemen as one of the world's most challenging river blindness programs because of war, mountainous terrain, and isolated communities. Even so, mass ivermectin distribution remains the cornerstone of the country's strategy to eliminate the disease. So, I'm going to have to take a break here and I'll come back because there's a lot of suspicious things I still have to go over, so I'll be back on the other side.
The mass spread of flock cameras across the country has increasingly become an issue of deep concern to Americans. There's one organization that has sprung up called DFlock, which you can go to their website and you can see a map of where all the flock cameras are located. They're doing sort of standard First Amendment advocacy against the spread of this surveillance technology. The Flock CEO was asked about this group, and he labeled them as a terrorist organization. Let's take a listen.
You've got organizations like the ACLU and the EFF who take an above-board approach to fight for their point of view. And thankfully, we live in a beautifully democratic, capitalistic country where we can fight in court. And I have a lot of respect for those groups because they have reasonable debates and we follow the law. And then unfortunately, there's terroristic organizations like DFlock, whose primary motivation is chaos. They are closer to Antifa than they are anything else. And that, I think, is unfortunate because we don't want chaos, or I don't want chaos. I like law and order. I like a society that has a bedrock of safety. So for those groups, I think it's just disappointing that they haven't chosen a more constructive mannerism to try to get what they want, which they have a right to have. But that's why we have a democratically elected process, right? Like we're not forcing flock on anyone. Elected officials know that as a community, you want to be safe.
I mean, this is complete insanity, Sagar, but it also fits into the rhetorical and legal framework that the Trump admin has set up. It's not an accident that he named checks Antifa here because they've used NSPM7 and other tools to try to go after these left-wing groups that they label as terrorists. And so he adopts that language to try to, put DFLOC in the same category as these other groups that have been identified by the Trump administration as terrorists. But literally, you can go to their website. The tagline says, "Welcome to DFLOC, an open source project mapping license plate readers." Like, that's just a basic service and advocacy group that is, being provided to the public so that they can push back on what's happening in their communities where they've had very little say.
Yeah, I think this is absolutely insane, and it's pretty obvious that this CEO, first of all, DFLOC is a nonprofit organization. So if you're going to say that it's, terroristic or whatever, frankly, they should be able to sue if they want to, because, you can't just
defamatory.
Genuinely, I mean, that's an actual term which has meaning. It's a nonprofit organization which is open source, which allows people just to flag where flock cameras actually are. By that definition, Waze is a terrorist organization because it lets you flag where police officers are whenever they're trying to speed trap you. So let's start with that. The second thing, and I said this, I got such an angry message from a right-wing friend of mine where I said, I genuinely would trust a place like China or Singapore to surveil me to mass surveil me than I would Flock. And I'm about to show you why. Is because it is a for-profit company with very sketchy ability to actually hold to account and is, by the way, not wholly bought in by our democratic system, also with a profit motive. Okay, so you put those three things together, and lo and behold, you have the problems that befall all American institutions. Let's go and put this next one up here on a screen. In one California town, Flock misread license plates in 71% of the alerts that it sent to police. Summer of 2024, a police called a man to discuss a persistent problem with his license plate. The city's AI-powered license plate reader, made up by Flock, had repeatedly misread the plate. 6 times they had sent alerts to the Roseville Police Department identifying the vehicle as stolen or used in a felony crime. Police could see that the Flock software kept confusing 9 for an 8. The car owner said he would take off his license plate cover, and soon after, it happened again. So this guy is getting harassed by the police because the AI license plate reader is not reading his plate correctly. Now, again, if you're going to pay this company all this money, you're going to mount all these cameras in public and make it so that we're basically eroding all public privacy, you would at the very least say, could it work? And yet, in this case, it's not working. Second one is that we also know about institutional misuse and abuse. This also happened many times with the NSA with their warrantless spying program. Let's put this one up here on the screen. How rogue officers turned a nationwide camera network into a tool for stalking. So, for example, they interview a woman, Marcy Bakley. She couldn't understand how her ex-boyfriend always seemed to know where she was. When she went to buy groceries, he would text her about it, sometimes within minutes, despite he was working 15 miles from her home as police chief in a small town in Atlanta. One day in 2024, when he incorrectly suspected that she'd gone to see a man against his wishes, he messaged her, "I didn't think you would slip up." She began to feel like she was constantly being watched. She installed cameras around her home and on her patio to see if he was stalking her. She bought a hidden camera detector 3 times in desperation. She drove her car to a mechanic's shop. Then one day she pressed him for answers, and he said he was using his Flock access as a police officer. Quote, like thousands of other law enforcement agencies, his police force can follow cars spotted by Flock's sprawling network of AI roadside cameras, which record passing license plate into a mappable database that officers can then search while investigating a crime. However, they then note that it's obviously rife for abuse. Now, to be clear, he was arrested on charges of stalking, harassment, and license plate misreader abuse. But as you can see very clearly, is that there are no actual checks within the system from stopping these small town sheriffs or any of these other places with very little accountability to be able to use it for whatever ends that they want.
Okay, in this final episode, I'm going to be going over the World Bank and McNamara and all that. And yes, I'm much calmer about it. McNamara just hit me out of the left field. I have never been hit like that before, where I thought I had to kind of step back for a couple of days. So it was quite unusual. So it triggered a whole lot of things all at once. So anyway, so I'll be getting back to that, finishing up that. And it's actually a very fascinating story how he took over the World Bank and those black flies that they claim are doing all this stuff. But before I get started, a couple of things about cyclospora. There's a man named Redfield, and he was the director of the CDC a few years ago. But anyways, they always come out and make quotes, right? If you think that they're not all on the same team, well, listen to this quote. This is what he said. The safest thing to do is get locally grown vegetables because the real risk in these the safest thing to do is get locally grown vegetables because the real risk is these internationally imported vegetables right now. Yeah. Blame it on the rest of the world, right? So anyways, a quick little story about Taylor Farms since they've been in the news. Just a month before Taylor Fresh Foods began grappling with a sweeping multi-state lettuce recall, the Salinas-based company filed a civil lawsuit against one of its former presidents and his wife, accusing the couple of a years-long $32 million embezzlement operation. Meanwhile, workers in Mexico are getting laid off, probably with no benefits, right? So basically what happened was this. Cisco, the largest U.S. food distributor, said it has stopped buying iceberg lettuce from both Taylor Farms, Mexico operations, and Mexico generally, for now, shifting to U.S. sources. Well, got news for you, not going to be any safer. But anyway, so basically this guy's name is Brian Thure, Thure. He was employed there as of March 2026 as president of the Tennessee subsidiary. The lawsuit happened April 2026. The lawsuit alleges he admitted wrongdoings in texts to the CEO. So I guess maybe in a drunken night or something, he texted himself to the CEO saying, oh, I did it. So, June the 5th, Taylor Fresh Food files a $32 million civil lawsuit. And then 1 month later, July 16th to 17th, FDA identifies Taylor Farms in Mexico in its traceback. I don't know, coincidence? I don't really know, but when you ride with criminals, you're riding with criminals, right? And that's how it all rolls. So anyway, so where'd the money go? Well, he spent $5.5 million on a luxury home in Hawaii, $1.5 million on 400 acres in California, millions more developing the ranch. They always like to be charitable too. $1 million endowment to UC Berkeley, named the Brian and Julie Thure Right Tackle Endowment. They bought a $15,000 golf cart for the Hawaiian property, a personal chef, a personal driver, a handyman, a personal trainer. Wow, that's really something else, huh? Guy was really living high on the hog, so to speak. So anyway, so it's always interesting how these people all reflect against each other, right? And for example, those Pod Save America guys, well, I find it amazing that all of Obama's screenwriters or scriptwriters were all a team of white boys. So anyways, they have this show, Pod Save America, and Pod Save this, Pod Save that. Well, they're living high. They're in Beverly Hills, most of them, from what I understand. And so they did a show and they called Trump's son-in-law is a fucking crook. Just like Obama wasn't a crook, right? So keep in mind, just because it appears to be okay to be a crook now, in the end, will it be something to be proud of? The one thing my mom instilled in me is this: you will be judged by those we hang around and our actions. Try to stop painting red flags white. These people are not our friends. They want to control your time. Give it to them and protect it. It's your choice. So I want to clear up something about in the last show with these bio attacks. I was talking about Annie Jacobson, the author who goes around talking about these things. Well, let me be very clear about this. Annie Jacobson and her idea of a bio attack is really like this: that something escapes and all hell breaks loose. So That's really not exactly how I see this thing playing out, because I see them as setting the stage right now, poisoning the land, poisoning the water, wiping out Africa. And aspirin is back in the news again. If you've been taking aspirin for your heart, well, it was bad advice here again. So anyhow, you know, after World War II, the U.S. bailed out Japan, gave them tons of cash, and they also got those Unit 731 plans, right? They just announced the other day they're helping Japan again. Now, the United States has no money, and the reason they've been borrowing most of their money has been from Japan. And so now Japan's in trouble, so they're giving money back to Japan. So see how circular this whole thing is? So anyways, so watch out for those bear aspirins. So anyways, I'm going to get started here. The World Bank was created in 1944 at the Bretton Woods Conference and officially began operations in 1946. Here's the timeline. 1944, delegates from 44 allied nations established the World Bank. It was originally the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And they did this at the Bretton Woods Conference. 1946, the World Bank begins lending, initially to help rebuild Europe after World War II. 1947, its first loan goes to France for post-war reconstruction. 1968, Robert McNamara becomes the 5th president of the World Bank after resigning as U.S. Secretary of Defense. 1968 to 1981, McNamara dramatically expands the bank's size and shifts much of its focus toward poverty reduction, agriculture, education, health, and infrastructure in developing countries. So, critics of the World Bank have raised concerns such as large infrastructure projects sometimes displace local communities. Some countries accumulated significant debt. Yeah, and some of them are still in that debt today. Structural adjustment policies in the 1980s and 1990s, mostly after McNamara's tenure, were criticized for reducing public spending and social services in some cases. Economic gains were not distributed equally within or across countries. Surprising, huh? So before McNamara, the World Bank focused largely on large infrastructure projects such as dams, power plants, highways, and ports. All vehicles also to destroy, right? Those dams, those power plants. And they also did their annual lending was much smaller. And health and poverty reduction were not major priorities. Pay attention to that. But during McNamara's presidency, which was 1968 to 1981, World Bank lending expanded several-fold. Lending increasingly targeted sub-Saharan Africa. Now, isn't that fascinating? I guess McNamara was really worried about Africa also. Agriculture, rural development, education, public health, and population programs became central priorities. The bank became involved in major disease control initiatives, including the 1974 River Blindness Control Program. Now, aren't these things that kind of strike you as odd for a bank being involved in? Well, it kind of does me, but anyway, so in that sense, many historians describe McNamara as having redirected the World Bank toward developing countries, particularly Africa. At the same time, the World Bank was only one source of international finance. During roughly the same period, countries also received funding from the IMF, bilateral agencies like the USAID, UK's development agencies, former colonial powers, the United Nations, and later regional institutions such as the African Development Bank. One of the interesting historical questions which economists and historians continue to debate is whether the rapid expansion of development lending produced long-term self-sustaining growth, or whether it also contributed to long-term debt dependent in some countries. Robert McNamara was a pivotal figure in expanding the World Bank, lending to Africa. making poverty reduction, agriculture, education, and health central priorities. His tenure marked a major increase in international development financing for the region, although the long-term outcomes remain debated, with some countries experiencing significant gains and others facing persistent debt challenges. So, in 1973, the river blindness had been recognized by the then head of the World Bank, Robert McNamara, as a major disease of massive health and socioeconomic importance, and one in dire need of combating in West Africa. And he became the key agent for change, or I would say murder. In 1974, following international recognition of the dramatic consequences of disabling and disfiguring river blindness in Africa, 4 United Nations agencies, including the World Bank, launched the River Blindness Control Program in West Africa. The program covered 1.2 million kilometers, protecting 30 million people in 11 countries from river blindness. For over a decade, operations were exclusively based on the spraying of insecticides by helicopters and aircraft over the breeding sites of vector black flies in order to kill their larvae. So yes, before they got started on all that, they were spreading all these insecticides to kill those black flies, and I'll be getting to those black flies here in a minute. The name McNamara's Morons referred to Project 1000, which began in 1966. McNamara believed the military could both increase manpower and provide disadvantaged young men with education and job skills, or lead to their death and turn them into drug addicts like they did my cousin, however that worked out, right? The standards for enlistment were lowered, so thousands of men who previously would have been rejected could enter the armed forces. The program ultimately enlisted about 400,000 men. Critics argued that many recruits had intellectual disabilities or very low aptitude scores. They suffered disproportionately high casualties in Vietnam. The promised education and career benefits often failed to materialize. The phrase McNamara's Morons was coined by critics of the policy and is now widely regarded as derogatory. So after leaving the Pentagon in 1968, McNamara became president of the World Bank. This is where his reputation becomes much more complicated. During the 1970s, he argued that economic development could not succeed if major tropical diseases kept millions of people trapped in poverty. One disease he repeatedly highlighted was river blindness. At the time, approximately 30 million people were living in endemic areas of West Africa. Fertile river valleys were being abandoned because of black fly transmission. Blindness and severe skin disease reduced agriculture productivity and economic development. McNamara viewed river blindness as both a humanitarian catastrophe and a major obstacle to economic development. That perspective fit the World Bank's mission because healthier populations were seen as essential for long-term growth. Or another way to look at it would be get rid of those people so then you have the whole land to yourself, right? I mean, there's two ways to look at these things, right? So let's look at the 1974 River Blindness Control Program. And the real word is 1974 Onchocerciasis Control Program, or the OCP. I'm just using river blindness to prevent myself from having to stumble over one more word. In 1974, 4 major international organizations launched the OCP. World Bank, World Health Organization, who are you going to call them? Food and Agriculture Organizations, United Nations Development Programs. The initial program covered approximately 1.2 million square kilometers, 11 West African countries, roughly 30 million people. Early control relied almost entirely on aerial larviciding, spraying rivers to kill black fly larvae before ivermectin became available. When Merck announced a donation of ivermectin in 1987, the program expanded dramatically because treatment of people could be combined with vector control. A remarkable contrast. McNamara's legacy illustrates how the same individual can be remembered in very different ways depending on the context. Vietnam historians often focus on the escalation of the war, systems analysis, body count metrics, and Project 100,000, the McNamara Moron Project. Global health historians often emphasize his role in bringing World Bank resources to neglected tropical diseases, including river blindness. Critics argue that his role in escalating the Vietnam War and policies such as Project 1000 caused immense suffering. For many veterans and families, those decisions dominate his legacy. Yes, some of us will never get over McNamara. He is the first person on my official hate list, okay? I have never publicly hated a single person, but he is number one on my list. Supporters of his later work point to his leadership at the World Bank, where he expanded lending for poverty reduction, agriculture, education, and public health. They credit him with helping bring international attention and funding to diseases such as river blindness. I would love to meet the supporters of his work and have a little chat with him. What a delusional crowd of people. Many historians hold both views simultaneously. They acknowledge that his World Bank work literally benefited millions of people, while also concluding that his Vietnam-era decisions contributed to a costly and controversial war. And this is where the historians are missing it, right? He did not have his time benefiting millions of people when he was at the World Bank, and he also did some pretty horrible things during Vietnam. So McNamara was horrible all the way around. The river control program is often cited as one of the World Bank's major public health successes. Well, I guess that depends on how you look at success, right? Well, let me see here. What's our metric here? How many people we kill in a day, or how much money we raise? They acknowledge that the World Bank work likely benefited millions of people, while also concluding that his Vietnam-era decisions contributed to a costly and controversial war. It is cited as one of the bank's major public health successes. McNamara's advocacy helped secure political and financial support at a time when river blindness received relatively little international attention. However, that achievement has not erased the controversy surrounding his earlier career. And I would say controversy that hopefully will surround this portion of his career, right? The bioengineering and bioweapons using them in Africa. I'll keep reading and back off here for a second. I can see myself starting to get a little bit steamed here. Oh boy. In all these years, I have never had to take a break because I was so upset over something. Never. I'll keep reading. McNamara himself reflected publicly on Vietnam later in life. In his 1995 memoir, In Retrospect, The Tragedy and Lessons of Vietnam, he wrote that the United States had been wrong, terribly wrong, in key aspects of its approach to the war. Some people viewed this as a meaningful acknowledgement of mistakes. Others felt it came far too late and did not amount to full accountability. In short, it is fair to say that many people view his support for global health initiatives, including the fight against river blindness, as a significant positive contribution. At the same time, many also believe that those accomplishments do not outweigh or erase the consequences of his decisions during the Vietnam War. Those two assessments are coexisting in discussions about his legacy. So let's talk a little bit about what happened. How did they get there, right? I started off talking about colonization. One of my first shows that I did was about what they did in Berlin, okay? And we need to review this for a second here. November 15th, 1884, Africa was colonized. November 15th, 1884, the Berlin Conference begins. European powers formalized the partitions of Africa. 1960, the Year of Africa. Independence spreads rapidly. 1975, most European colonial governments have withdrawn. 1994, apartheid ends in South Africa, making the close of the colonial era across the continent. But that really wasn't what happened. It never ended. I will be talking more about Walter Rodney in a future event. I was going to cover it this show, but he needs his own space for me to talk about him. A great man named Walter Rodney was murdered by a car bomb in Guyana in the 80s. He was the first to talk about them never leaving. And now it's been acknowledged. It's true. They all admit, yeah, they never really did leave Africa right now. But Walter Rodney is dead. I will have a show about him soon. That show and the next show, I was going to talk about him. But this show is just too much for me to handle it all. Because I'm still shocked that I didn't hear about Walter earlier in my hunting around Africa. His story wound up in the academic world. I want to make sure the rest of us know his story. They were after him for years and years, and they finally got him by car bomb. I only found out about Walter Rodney when I was doing the show about Daphne in Malta. She was also car bombed. At the time, I did a search for anyone else that was car bombed, and Walter Rodney came up. So he has been in my files for quite a while now. I already have his show written. I'm already ready to go with it. Just give me some space and some time here. So let's take a look at how this all got going. The purpose of my work is to get to the root of things, right? How did this evil really get started? Well, the late 1800s to early 1900s, colonial medicine. European colonial powers established medical services throughout Africa. Some work generally reduced diseases such as smallpox and sleeping sickness, but I would argue they did not. But anyways, medicine was also used to support colonial administration, labor systems, and military control. Researchers often viewed African populations as convenient subjects for large-scale experiments or interventions that would not have been acceptable in Europe. So the 1990s to the 1930s, there was a sleeping sickness campaign. Large epidemics of sleeping sickness called African trypanosomes affected Central and East Africa. Colonial governments introduced mass screening and treatment campaigns. Some drugs available at the time, such as atoxyl, an arsenic-containing compound, caused serious side effects, including blindness, because they were used before modern clinical trial standards existed. The intent was to control disease, but treatment programs often involved compulsory examinations and treatment with medicines that were incompletely understood. 1920s to the 1950s, the era of forced public health measures. In several colonies, health authorities imposed compulsory vaccinations, quarantines, relocations, and medical examinations. These programs sometimes reduced disease transmission, but were frequently carried out without informed consent or meaningful community choice. 1940s to the 1960s, colonial research institutes. European governments established tropical medicine institutes across Africa. Many produced valuable scientific discoveries, but ethical oversight varied greatly by modern standards. Questions about informed consent, risk disclosure, and participant autonomy were often secondary to research objectives. 1970s, Apartheid South Africa and Project Coast. One of the best documented examples is Project Coast, South Africa's secret chemical and biological warfare program. So for those of you saying, oh, she's crazy, ivermectin was not a bioweapon, listen up. Project Coast, South Africa's secret chemical and biological warfare program in the 1970s. Gee, that was around the time they said they were leaving, right? Directed by Walter Basson, it operated during the apartheid era. Investigations after apartheid found that the program researched chemical and biological agents for military purposes that had been linked to unethical human experiments and covert operations. The extent of every allegation remains debated, but the existence of the program itself is well documented. In other words, nothing that came out of my own sweet little head here, okay? During the Cold War, African countries became areas for proxy conflicts involving the United States, Soviet Union, Cuba, China, France, and others. Medical programs many times overlapped with intelligence, military logistics, or geopolitical competition. And then, of course, we have the HIV/AIDS era. And keep in mind, if you go into a country and you create the diseases, then you can become the savior, right? Hey, we got rid of the sleeping sickness. Hey, we got rid of AIDS. But really, you're just bragging about something that you created yourself, right? So 1980 to the 2000s, and this is about the time they started going around with the river blindness also, right? Africa became the epicenter of the global HIV epidemic. This period saw enormous investments in research, vaccine trials, treatment studies, and prevention programs. Most of these studies were conducted under increasingly strict ethical rules compared with earlier decades. Boy, that's a relief. But debates continued over standards of care, placebo-controlled trials, access to medicines after studies ended, and whether poorer countries received equitable treatment. These debates influenced international research ethics and helped strengthen protection for participants. And this is the clever part. I think this was an act of evil genius. The campaigns relied much more on community organization and repeated local engagement rather than mass advertising. There wasn't one global strategy. Approaches evolved over time and varied by country. Researchers have documented both successes and challenges. Common elements included this: community-directed treatment. Beginning in the 1990s, many African programs adopted the community-directed treatment with ivermectin model. Villages selected trusted local volunteers to distribute the tablets rather than relying solely on outside health workers. Yeah, get your own people to kill their own people, right? That's how it all works now. Annual or semi-annual visits. Distributors returned each year, measured people's height or weight to determine the dose, recorded who received treatment, and encouraged those who missed the previous round to participate. And they had health education. Programs explained that river blindness was caused by worms transmitted by black flies and emphasized that repeated treatment reduced itching, skin disease, and the risk of blindness. In many communities, people reported that severe itching decreased after treatment. Those visible improvements were often cited by program organizers as an important reason people should continue participating. You notice they're not talking about, well, we tested them before, we tested them after, we understand why they're itching. No, they don't understand any of that stuff. And they use village chiefs, religious leaders, teachers, and local health workers were frequently involved in encouraging participation and organizing distribution days. Some communities were hesitant or refused treatment for reasons including fear of side effects, rumors about the medicine, distrust of governments or foreign organizations, religious or cultural concerns, treatment fatigue after many years of annual campaigns. Those issues are described in public health studies of mass drug administration and are one reason programs invested heavily in community engagement. So, the part that I will stumble upon till the day that I die is this. They do not kill the adult worm, which is the factory for all these baby worms, right? I find that interesting because, and then they introduce this Wolbachia bacteria, which is really kind of like the power plant of the whole thing. So, yeah, I could find nothing about any efforts to get rid of the main big worm, the one they talked about living for 10 to 15 years inside these people's bodies. The effort was all on getting rid of those tiny worms, right? And they claim the discovery of Wolbachia transformed research on river blindness because it showed that the parasite has an Achilles heel. Instead of trying to poison the worm directly, scientists found they could target its essential bacterial partner. Researchers continue to investigate other drugs that can kill the adult one more quickly, but yeah, kind of lacking. No one seems to have really jumped on that deal, right? So all these years, they returned and gave people these ivermectin pills, and that was only to kill the tiny worms. That big one that was in them, that one lived for 10 to 15 years. That just strikes me as a little bit odd, right? So how did they discover this Wolbachia business? Well, in 1924, American scientists Marshall Hertig and S. Burt Wolbach were studying mosquitoes at Harvard Medical School. While examining the reproductive tissues of the mosquito Culex pipiens under a microscope, they noticed tiny bacteria living inside the insect cells. Because the organism was first described by Hertig and named in honor of Wolbach, it became known as Wolbachia. At that time, they had no idea how widespread or important it would prove to be. So yeah, they continued studying it through the 30s and the 70s. No one knew it was infecting millions of insect species. No one suspected it played a role in parasitic worms. Yeah, no one just really suspected much, right? And then there was, in 1995, a landmark study by Mark J. Taylor, a colleague, demonstrates that the bacteria were not accidental passengers. They said the worm depends on Wolbachia for normal survival and reproduction. So yeah, this whole thing of this Wolbachia business and the Laua, I don't know. This stuff is just strange, right? So then in the 2000s, the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine and several international collaborators lead much of the research on doxycycline therapy for river blindness and lymphatic fluorosis. Their work helped establish doxycycline as an important option for treating individual patients, although it is less practical than ivermectin for mass drug administration. So I don't know. Like I said, all this stuff, when you start to read into the details, it becomes even fuzzier, right? So I hope you remember Ashford from the last show. Richard W. Ashford and the Liverpool doxycycline researchers were in the same broad scientific field, tropical parasitology. In fact, Ashford spent much of his career at the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine and later became president of parasite and vector biology there. So, yeah, I don't think there's that many people in this field. I think it's a pretty small little group, which probably makes it pretty easy, right? So, because what they were doing is, then they were saying, well, we can't really do this drug because we can't do this mass thing. But anyways, I'm going to get off of that subject for now. The Loa, that was first described. The worm was first described scientifically in the late 1700s after European physicians observed a worm moving beneath the eye of people returning from West Africa. The species was formally named in 1800s, mainly in the rainforests of Cameroon, Gabon, Republic of the Congo, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Central African Republic, Equatorial Guinea, and parts of Nigeria. But this one, interestingly enough, did not spread by black flies. It was spread by deer flies, which are also called mango flies. So, why was ivermectin ideal? Well, it checked almost every box public health officials wanted. One oral tablet, inexpensive to manufacture, generally effective against several parasitic worms. Long safety record when used appropriately. See, here's where it gets fuzzy, because when you read words like that and then you go to research, well, what was a safety record? You really come up empty-handed usually. And they liked this also, ivermectin, because it could be given out by trained community volunteers rather than physicians. Once or twice yearly programs. That made it easier to treat entire populations, not just individuals. For example, in some villages, the process looked like this. Health workers arrive once each year. Everyone lines up. Height or weight determines the dose. Nearly every eligible resident receives ivermectin the same day. Africa becomes the center. The largest ivermectin campaign occurred in Africa. And then we have the outliers, right? Which I'm still very, very suspicious of. Here's how the treatment went. 1987 to 1997, about 96 million treatments. 1987 to 2017, about 2.8 billion treatments. 1987 to 2022, over 4.4 billion treatments. 1987 to 2025, we get to the number of 5 billion treatments are given. The tablets were free thanks to Merck in the USA, but distribution across dozens of countries required a large international effort. Yeah, it took them all, right? It was Merck and Company donated the drugs, World Health Organization, the Task Force for Global Health, the Carter Center, National Ministries of Health, United States Agencies for Development internationally, the former UK Department for International Development, numerous NGOs and local community organizations. So basically, what was the pitch they made? Well, this is always interesting, right? Well, rather than waiting for people to become blind or severely ill, health officials realized they could treat almost everyone in an at-risk community once or twice each year. That meant parasites inside people were killed before causing severe disease. But you got to ignore that big worm still living here, right? Infected people were less likely to pass parasites back to insect vectors. Transmission gradually declined. After many years, some regions stopped local transmissions altogether. So, most communities received ivermectin once or twice per year. Programs often continued for 10 to 20 years. In areas with very intense transmission, they sometimes continued for 25 years or longer. Why so long, you ask? Well, ivermectin does not kill the adult worms. It mainly kills the microscopic larvae that causes symptoms that are picked up by black flies. The adult worms can survive about 10 to 15 years, sometimes longer. So repeated treatment is needed until the adult worms die naturally and transmission is interrupted. So a typical village might receive treatments like this. Year 1, everyone treated. Year 2, everyone treated again. Year 3, everyone treated again. And that goes to year 15. Treatment continues. Eventually, surveillance shows transmission has stopped and treatment can end. And here's some examples. In Uganda, some districts received annual ivermectin for around 20 years before transmissions were considered interrupted. In Nigeria, many communities have received treatment since the 1990s, and some programs are still ongoing in certain areas. Democratic Republic of the Congo. Because transmission remains intense in parts of the country, some communities have reached annual ivermectin for more than 25 years. How many people? Well, the scale is extraordinary. More than 100 million people have been treated annually for river blindness in many recent years. So, if you imagine someone born in an endemic African village in 1995, it is entirely possible they received ivermectin every year throughout much of their childhood and early adulthood, depending on whether their community remained eligible for treatment. This long-term community-wide approach is one reason the program is often cited as one of the largest sustained public health interventions ever conducted. So, Merck did not pay for all the logistics. Distribution, training, surveillance, and delivery was supported by governments, the WHO organization, the Carter Center, USAID, and other organizations. So the donations began with one disease, but they also started to fund other things, right? Because one reason the 1987 decision is frequently highlighted in public health is that Merck continued to donate the medicine without setting a numerical limit or an end date. At that time, this was an unprecedented commitment by a pharmaceutical company and became the foundation for decades of mass treatment campaigns that ultimately distributed billions of treatments worldwide. Jimmy Carter entered the picture after that decision. The challenge immediately became, how do you get millions of tablets to some remote villages in the world? Merck recognized it could manufacture the drug, but it could not build a global public health delivery system by itself. That required partnerships with WHO, ministries of health, NGOs, and eventually the Carter Center. One of the key people connecting these efforts was Dr. William Foege, F-O-E-G-E. He had been a leader in the global smallpox eradication campaign, became the first executive director of the Carter Center, and chaired the Mesotic Expert Committee after Merck announced the donation. He helped design the system for deciding where the medicine would go and ensuring it reached affected communities. So yeah, the Carter Center is the key here, right? This Dr. William Foege, quite a guy, right? He was also involved in smallpox. Well, I've already talked extensively about smallpox. So essentially it happened like this. 1987, Merck decides to donate the medicine out of the goodness of their hearts. 1988, distribution system and expert committees are organized. 1990 onward, the Carter Center becomes one of the largest delivery partners in Africa and Latin America. An interesting detail is that Merck itself has repeatedly credited Jimmy Carter's later leadership, saying that although Carter did not seek credit, his ability to mobilize governments and partners was critical to making the long-term program succeed. From a business perspective, Roy Vagelos, that's V-A-G-E-L-O-S, 1987 decision was extraordinary. Most pharmaceutical donations at the time were limited to quantity or duration. Merck committed to manufacture and donate an indefinite supply of a patented medicine with no preset end date, something that was widely viewed as unprecedented in the pharmaceutical industry. So in 1987, Merck CEO P. Roy Vagelos publicly argued that people were going blind from river blindness simply because they were too poor to buy the medicine. Merck therefore decided to donate ivermectin indefinitely. The primary focus was a neglected tropical disease affecting some of the world's poorest communities. And then along came George W. Bush and this thing called the PEPFAR. President George W. Bush announced the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, or PEPFAR, as a major U.S. foreign initiative. Bush repeatedly described it in moral terms, saying wealthy nations had an obligation to help combat HIV/AIDS in poorer countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. Anthony Fauci, then director of NIAID, became one of the principal scientific and operational leaders involved in implementing the HIV treatment and prevention effort. So basically they said, well, we have the resources and technology. Millions of poor people do not. We should help them. And that was exactly how it all got started. So they had the Merck program, they had the PEPFAR program, they had the Ivermectin, and then the PEPFAR funded the HIV. So that's how it all goes. Vargas later described discussions inside Merck when they tried to figure out what to do. He also said in a New York Times Magazine cover story highlighting the situation and publicly asked what Merck would do with his almost miraculous drug. According to his recollection, that increased the pressure on the company to make a decision. So the decision was not made in isolation. It came after scientists inside Merck identified a potential treatment. Who connected researchers brought the problem to Merck? Clinical trials showed remarkable results. Governments couldn't pay, and the issue received public attention. And to understand Merck, we need to understand how this all got started. Merck was a German company. Originally, there was one Merck, founded in 1668 in Darmstadt, Germany. It is one of the oldest pharmaceutical companies in the world. But during World War I, the U.S. government seized the American subsidiary of the German company under the Trading with the Enemy Act. So that American subsidiary then became an independent company called Merck and Company Incorporated USA, known as MSD, outside the USA. Meanwhile, the original German company continued as Merck KGaA. Today, they are completely separate companies, although they share this historical root. So I tried to look and figure out how much did Merck invest in all this. No one has published a single total dollar amount for this donation program. The company has never publicly stated that I could find. They didn't say, for example, well, we spent $8 billion or $15 billion. All that I have is what was publicly documented, that in 1987, Merck began donating it. 1998, programs expand to this other lymphatic filariasis. 2017, Merck commits to supplying up to 100 million additional treatments. So yeah, and then commitment was extended. So I guess the extended is to 2030. So as of right now, I could not find any amount of money that Merck has spent on all this. But I did find that supposedly they're going to be handing this stuff out until 2030. So, in other words, Merck supplied the medicine. The Carter Center became one of the key organizations that helped build the infrastructure to get it to millions of people. So, a lot of people, right? Let me see here. And here's where it happened. The documented history is that after World War II, the United States established a very large, long-term military presence in West Germany. And I'm going to give you a little bit about the history of what was going on, because I thought, and I still think, that when they expanded Germany into Africa, it was hidden for years. And I'm not guessing about this. It was, in fact, hidden for years. And I'm still convinced that they moved it there to become another biolab, right? Well, I think I've kind of answered my own question, because now Africa is loaded with biolabs, and I have a whole list of all the different incidents they've had listed down below. I can't logically read them all for you, but I've documented them all. They had been in Africa with labs and tests and all this stuff for a very long time. So what the claim was that after World War II, the United States established a large, long-term military presence in West Germany. Stuttgart became a major command center, including the United States European Command, or EUCOM. For decades, and this is where the trick came in, most U.S. military operations involving Africa were coordinated through EUCOM rather than a separate Africa command. When AFRICOM was created in 2007, it was also headquartered in Stuttgart instead of Africa. There is extensive evidence that European colonial systems continue to shape Africa after World War II, and that Cold War competition led both the U.S. and Soviet Union to intervene in African politics and conflicts. History of the Cold War have documented that Africa became a major area for proxy conflicts. The U.S., Soviet Union, Cuba, France, Britain, South Africa, and others supported governments or insurgent groups in different countries. Much of this was covert at the time, but is now well documented. Human rights researchers have documented torture, disappearance, and abuses by a variety of African governments and armed groups, sometimes with foreign backing or training. Those are real historical subjects with substantial evidence. Some journalists and independent researchers have gone further, suggesting that Africa served as a place where powerful governments and organizations could conduct activities with less scrutiny because of weaker institutions or limited international attention. Some specific allegations have later been substantiated. Others remain unproven or have been contradicted by available evidence. Well, I think that they were hiding it for a long time, right? Just like they hid the nuclear plants coming into UK, Russia, and the United States. So, and I already talked about that South Africa secret place. So yeah, organizations and later truth commissions have documented torture, disappearances, political assassinations, secret detention, and abuses committed by governments and armed groups. Some foreign governments provided military or intelligence assistance to regimes later accused of abuses, and those relationships have become better documented over time. Today, there are many more laboratories across Africa than there were decades ago. Most were involved in malaria, tuberculosis, HIV, Ebola, Lassa fever, emerging infectious disease, food safety, and public health surveillance. International funding has come from African governments, universities, the World Health Organization, the African Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the U.S., Europe, China, and philanthropic organizations. One area many historians agree is that Africa remains strategically important because of its resources: cobalt, lithium, uranium, rare earth elements, oil, natural gas, gold, and other critical minerals. Competition among major powers, including the U.S., China, Russia, European countries, Turkey, and Gulf states, is widely recognized and extensively documented. Project Coast in South Africa. Investigations after the end of apartheid found evidence that the program researched chemical and biological agents, developed assassination tools, explored crowd control chemicals, conducted secret research through front companies. That program became public through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and later court proceedings. It is one of the clearest documented examples of a secret biological chemical warfare program on the African continent. Congo and intelligence operations. The 1960 to 1961 Congo crisis has been extensively documented. Evidence now shows involvement by the CIA, Belgian intelligence, Soviet intelligence, the United Nations, neighboring African governments. There are still debates over every operational detail, but foreign intelligence involvement in Congolese politics during that period is well established. Rhodesia in South Africa. Historians continue to debate whether Rhodesian forces deliberately used biological agents such as anthrax through the Bush War. There is evidence suggesting unusual anthrax outbreaks during that period, but there is no historical consensus. And I have the whole list of them down below for you to take a look at. So this is not new to Africa. It basically started in 1884 with that Berlin conference. Then 1890, they came in with the colonial disease campaigns. 1945 to 1960, decolonization begins. 1960 to 61, crisis in the Congo and Patrice Lumumba. After Congo gained independence, the CIA became directly involved in the political struggle. Declassified and congressional material confirms that CIA officers were instructed to seek Lumumba's assassination and that poison was sent to Congo. Although the CIA's poison was not ultimately the method by which he was killed. This is one of the clearest examples of an allegation once dismissed as extreme becoming supported by official documentations. So, 2003, following September 11th, the United States created the Combined Joint Task Force in Horn of Africa. The task force essentially operated at sea and moved alongshore to Camp Lemonnier. So, I don't know. Camp Lemonnier was one of the first bases they set up over there. So basically, in 2007 to 2008, AFRICOM was created in Stuttgart. And that's when the whole thing got going, right? And they covered it up for years, but the list I have of what was going on shows that they were doing a lot over there. They had a lot of reasons to want to cover it up, right? So, I'm going to skim past most of these because I have it all documented down below. Because before AFRICOM existed, U.S. European Command in Stuttgart held principal responsibilities for much of Africa. AFRICOM was then created and headquartered in Stuttgart rather than on the African continent. Its primary acknowledged forward base developed at Camp Lemonnier. From that structure, military leadership extended into countries that already contained major colonial or post-colonial medical research institutes. So yeah, they just slid into all those ones that had been set up before, right? I looked at Amura, the guy from Japan, and Ashford to see if their careers intersected. Although Satsumi Amura and R.W. Ashford worked in different scientific disciplines, their careers ultimately converged around the fight against parasitic diseases. Omura discovered a soil bacterium that produced the Ivermectin, a family of compounds with powerful anti-parasitic activity. Merck scientists led by William C. Campbell and colleagues developed these compounds into ivermectin, which became one of the world's most widely used anti-parasitic medicine. Once ivermectin entered clinical use, it became a cornerstone of tropical medicine. Physicians, parasitologists, and public health researchers, including scientists working in the same field as Ashford, used it extensively in programs to control river blindness and later lymphatic filariasis. Each specialty played a different role in the process. Soil microbiologists searched nature for microorganisms capable of producing useful compounds. Natural products chemists isolated and characterized those compounds. Medicinal chemists refined them for therapeutic use. Pharmacologists studied their safety and effectiveness. Veterinarians first demonstrated many of the practical applications in animals. Clinical researchers conducted human trials, while tropical medicine physicians and parasitologists implemented large-scale treatment programs and studied the diseases in the field. In that sense, O'Meara and Ashford approached the same global problem from opposite directions. Because what I started thinking when I was going through all this was, it sounds to me like one glove fits the other glove perfectly, right? It sounded to me like what O'Meara was doing got further implemented by the Ashford crowd, and I think I was right. So here's how it worked out. In that sense, O'Meara and Ashford approached the same global problem from opposite directions. O'Meara began with the soil, searching for microorganisms that might yield new medicines. Ashford began with patients suffering from parasitic diseases, investigating the organisms responsible and how they spread. Their work became connected through the development and worldwide use of ivermectin in tropical medicine. Whether by long-term planning, institutional collaboration, or the natural evolution of scientific research, these careers complemented one another remarkably well. Scientists working in different disciplines ultimately became part of the same chain that led from a handful of soil samples in Japan to one of the largest global public health programs in history. And that's how I see the connection because, well, I think it got done under Unit 731 and it got shipped over to here. The U.S. conveniently owned the Merck labs and stuff. And oh my God, we got to help these poor people. So let's talk a little bit about these black flies because I've been very suspect of black flies. I've never attended science school, so when I was reading about black flies, they made it sound like it was extraordinary, right? They said, well, these black flies got these people. So I started asking the question, well, where do black flies even come from, right? From the lawa lawa and the black flies. You know, black flies are all over the place, but they can make a big deal out of them in Africa. They never figured out how to get rid of that big worm that lives for 10 to 15 years, just the small ones. So black flies are everywhere, but the black flies in Africa cause these problems, right? Well, that seems like a problem to me. I also see this in simple yet tragic terms. We will never know how many in Africa are suffering now or suffered in the past. The whole thing appears to me to have been generated to happen. To me, this is why I keep defining the worldwide kill box scenario that I'm talking about. I think Africa was put in a kill box early on. We must remember this. Our bodies are fine-tuned machines. We get sick when we get overloaded and it can't fight back. Like the sulfur in my home has overwhelmed my system, but I am still alive 6 years later. Had I sought medical help, I would be dead. If I was dead already, I would have stopped my work. That keeps me moving, right? I think doctors and scientists are pretty much of a trick. I'm not saying all of them are, but likely that entire crowd and all these scientific people online, they are a well-oiled machine. I looked into all of them, that whole group of doctors running around, John Rappaport, Alex Jones. In that ecosystem, they all have remarkably, like a few of them believe this, a few of them believe that, then they have a couple of fights amongst each other, and I trace the money and everything. So yeah, that whole group, I think is likely controlled opposition, right? They say a lot of good things that draw us in. It is a class divide system. These people seem to be gaining, right? Some of these people I looked into, they have several 100,000 followers. They're monetized. They're doing quite well. Cha-ching, cha-ching. They're using the same patterns they've used for years. They say things like, well, on my YouTube channel, you can't see all the suppressed stuff. Go over here. The same thing they're using to trick their followers. Like, for example, now they're saying, well, for the stuff that I can't show on YouTube, you got to go to Patreon and pay me to watch it there. Well, we all know that Patreon plays along with YouTube because years ago that happened, but people forget. So now people can now say, well, go to Patreon for my private stuff. And they're doing this now. They're saying, well, go to my website for the stuff I'm being. So I don't know. To me, they all seem to connect. I have never mentioned John Rappaport's name in my entire career because I never trusted him from the very beginning. He connects to Alex Jones for close to 20 years. That is a long commitment in time. And he is the one that got me interested in this whole group because they brought him into their group and called him their hero. Well, I don't think Rappaport is such a hero, but hey, everybody has to make their own decisions. It has been very isolating to be me in this position. I don't like talking about other people because it seems petty, but we need to understand people gather in groups to go after the rest of us with information, right? They get these cute little groups that say things that we like to hear. They're charming. They're sweet. They say the right things. We lock in. We spend our time. But there's always going to be something that's missing in there, right? I've ended up having to be a lone wolf in my research. Why is that? Well, I don't know, because I seem to have some reputation for being crazy. So people will say in the comments, well, she doesn't interview anybody. She only reads Wikipedia pages. None of those things are true. But you have to remember, this is all psychological. They have been after me for years. They're using the same tactics they described in their own literature. They came up with this sulfur business and stuff to go after important targets. So I may be crazy, but I'm important enough for them to want to kill. So I don't like going after other people because it's not time effective for me. But when it comes to cases of these people working in little groups and stuff, yes, I will evaluate the groups. But no, I'm not going to go slug by slug of what I found out about all of them because it's not important. What I'm saying is that there's lots of these little groups out there. Find your own path and keep moving. You may think, well, that sounds like lots of work and hassle that I'm going through. Well, if you prefer to just sit and watch, that's clearly your choice. But keep in mind, this is a game board where we learn and advance before returning home. The biggest event is unfolding now, the fight between good and evil. Which side are you on? I am glad, as sick as I am, that I have my work to do, that at least occupies my mind against the horrific pain. I will get to go home, and this will be in the past. I'm on the side of the truth. All I want is justice for the young men and women forced to flee their own countries to survive. I want to know it all. If we don't know, we are helpless. I want them to rise up, but alas, none of it is up to me. I have no role in any punishment of anybody after this, but I want to say this before I close. Ivermectin could theoretically, even no matter what you think about me, be used as a bioweapon strategy in a few straightforward ways. Toxic dosing. Give doses high enough or often enough to produce poisoning, potentially including neurological toxicity. Exploit vulnerable populations. That is also a bioweapon strategy. Administer it to people with biological circumstances that make treatment unusually dangerous. The classic real-world example is people with extremely high low loads, in whom ivermectin treatment can precipitate severe neurological adverse effects. Alter the formulation is also a bioweapon attack. A legitimate medicine could theoretically be contaminated, adulterated, or combined with another harmful substance while being distributed under the medicine's name. using mass distribution as a delivery system. Existing treatment campaigns can reach enormous numbers of people. If somebody deliberately introduced a harmful agent into such a system, the medical infrastructure would become the delivery mechanism for a biowar chemical. So, yes, giving out doses of ivermectin in Africa theoretically could be part of a bioweapon strategy. That is exactly how I see it. I see that Lawa business as ridiculous. Every murder has a plot line. They want theirs to be the only ones to help. I see it as murder of an innocent population that has been robbed, abused, and brutalized since the beginning. I am confident ivermectin got started in Unit 731, but I don't have a smoking gun, just the path of the researchers and how they connect. All of the COVID keyboard warriors, the Rogans, the Alex Jones crowd, this group, that group, none of them address the real issue. Why is that? They can't read the side effects before pushing them on the rest of us. There are the so-called experts claiming to be on the side of the truth. The government is out to get you, and we have the answer. Most of them likely are government agents themselves. The best way is to have your own experts, and then there is no room for further voices. All of them are conspiring. Who knows? They have not lacked funds or exposure. They have been getting a great deal of cash within their groups. I trace them all. They all fit together like a glove. Some of them say viruses aren't real. Some say vaccine is a lab leak. Some say, well, some say that. If you hang around people like Rappaport, Alex Jones, Dr. Malone, and Rogan and that group, what exactly do you expect? And let me give you some data here. On a Joe Rogan experience with the Dr. Pierre Corey and Brett Weinstein, Rogan explicitly asked, are there any side effects? Corey answered that there were, characterizing them as minor and transient, and mentioned nausea, headache, and dizziness, while emphasizing that ivermectin was very safe. Rogan then specifically asked what the potential side effects were. So then halfway into the show, Rogan presses him again, asking what critics are actually saying about the possible and potential side effects. And then he finally got an answer out of Corey, and Corey essentially said nausea, headache, dizziness generally resolve after stopping the drug. Severe adverse effects are exceedingly rare. He concludes that it is an extremely well-tolerated drug and then a very, very safe drug. That exchange between that Dr. Corey and Joe Rogan exchange show a particularly clear example. Rogan did ask about side effects, but Corey immediately characterized them as minor and transient, named nausea, headache, and dizziness, and finished by calling ivermectin a very, very safe drug. Earlier in the same discussion, Corey said his dream was for every household to have ivermectin available and suggested taking it at the first sign of a viral type illness. And then in December 2021, on a Joe Rogan appearance, that Robert Malone, the one that everybody quotes, Robert Malone spoke favorably about ivermectin and hydrochloroquine and described them as among the safest medicines we know. He discussed ivermectin in connection with this other person, and the argument was effective. Early treatment was being suppressed. So, yeah. So, where's Malone come from? Well, Malone comes from a background. He says that after the 2001 anthrax attacks, he went to work for a company called Dynaport, which held a major Department of Defense contract for biodefense medical products. Dynaport was located in Frederick, Maryland, adjacent to Fort Detrick. Malone dates this period to early 2000s. So he said himself, and it's been documented, that that's where he worked, right? Malone has also stated that he worked closely with research teams at USAMRID, the U.S. Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases located at Fort Detrick. He has also worked with the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, including biodefense drug development activities. He has characterized himself as having spent much of his career in the U.S. biodefense enterprise. So, most strikingly, Malone himself has said that at one point he was interviewed to become the scientific head of Fort Detrick after the anthrax attack. He also says that while at Diaport, he learned extensively about Fort Detrick's history and infrastructure. CIA contacts, Malone now openly says his biodefense work brought him into contact with CIA personnel. In a C-SPAN interview, he said that once he entered the biodefense world, contact with the CIA was essentially unavoidable. That is Malone's own characterization, not proof that Malone himself worked for the CIA. That is what he said. Robert Malone also supposedly invented the mRNA technology. Malone was an important early contributor to the technology that eventually became mRNA vaccines. In 1961, mRNA was discovered. 1989 to 1990, Robert Malone and colleagues demonstrated that laboratory-made mRNA can be delivered into cells and animals and cause them to make a specific protein. So yeah, in 1990s to 2010, numerous researchers developed the technology further. So in 2020, Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna deployed the first widely used mRNA vaccine. So essentially, Malone is a highly informed physician and biodefense researcher, repeatedly emphasizing that ivermectin was safety and touting its potential benefits. Alex Jones is an even clearer example. I checked specifically for his ivermectin messaging and whether he discussed adverse effects. In August to September 2021, Jones was strongly promoting ivermectin. He said his father had been extremely ill with COVID and had improved after taking ivermectin. Then, on September the 3rd, 2021, Jones went considerably further. He displayed ivermectin on InfoWars and appeared to be taking it on camera with another drug. So, yeah, he was taking the drugs, right? And then we have that Dr. John Campbell. That guy is a thorn in my side for years. March 2021. Campbell is publicly covering ivermectin and interviewing Tess Lawrie about it. 2021 to 2024, he repeatedly returns to ivermectin, discussing studies, its use during COVID, regulatory treatment of it, and later proposed applications. But here again, November 2025, Campbell gets COVID and publicly documents himself on camera taking ivermectin. So yes, I would say that was an endorsement, right? He personally took the drug on camera and made that decision the subject of a video for his multi-million subscriber audience. So yes, I checked the specific thing. On November the 3rd, 2025, the show is titled John Takes Ivermectin. The distinction is important. Campbell mentions side effects, but he does not give viewers a rundown of ivermectin's possible side effects. Instead, he talks about his own experience and said he experienced none. He says he took 24 milligrams a day for about 3 to 4 days during the illness. And then he says, and I had no side effects whatsoever. He also said that previously he had taken a lower dose and again, no side effects. And then later, while reading and discussing Corey's book, that doctor I talked about earlier called Ivermectin, he characterized it as a very safe generic drug. Campbell contrasts that with other COVID treatments, which he says can have potential side effects. He does repeatedly say that he's describing what he did rather than telling viewers what to do, and tells viewers to consult their doctors. So yeah, John Campbell personally took ivermectin on camera. Yes, he mentioned side effects, but the side effect statement was that he experienced none. Then we have another person named Brett Weinstein. Brett Weinstein is the strongest earlier example. Weinstein swallowed ivermectin during a Dark Horse podcast live stream. He and his wife, Heather Heng, also discussed using ivermectin prophylactically. Brett Weinstein is a character that connects to Rogan in that group. I'm not going to go too far into it, but Brett Weinstein has a brother named Eric Weinstein. They formed this thing called the dark web, or there's a little cabal of a group of them, right? The two brothers, and well, they all appear kind of insane to me, but everybody seems to love them, right? And so here's the connection. So Brett is over there taking ivermectin on camera, right? And his brother, Eric Weinstein, well, Eric's brother, Eric Weinstein is Brett's brother. Eric was a senior executive managing director at Thiel Capital, Peter Thiel's investment firm. Because I'd heard rumors that Peter Thiel was the one who funded that whole dark web internet thing that consists of Weinstein and his brother and that guy, Lex Friedman, that whole little club of people. So yeah, so Weinstein's pretty connected, right? He takes it on air also. Robert Kennedy Jr., he was associated with ivermectin, but it did not end with COVID. As HHS Secretary in July of 2026, he publicly supported an FDA emergency authorization of ivermectin for prevention of New World screwworms isolated in horses. That's a legitimate veterinary anti-parasitic use and completely separate from the disputed COVID indication. But it shows ivermectin remains within his policy orbit. And that just happened recently, but wheeling back a little bit, in July of 2023, during a Hill Rising interview, Kennedy called ivermectin really a miracle drug and claimed there were 100 studies showing profound benefits, which he characterized as roughly a 70 to 85% reduction in hospitalization and deaths. He pointed to countries such as Nigeria, where ivermectin was already used against river blindness as evidence supporting his argument. Kennedy was on Joe Rogan in 2023. He advanced an even broader argument that ivermectin and hydrochlorine had to be discredited in order to preserve the COVID vaccine program. His claim was essentially that recognition of an effective existing treatment would have jeopardized European use authorization, what he described as a $200 billion vaccine. So he's claiming that they held ivermectin back from you because it was so powerful and cured, because they really wanted to push through this $200 billion vaccine enterprise. Okay, so then in July of 2023, during a Fox News Jesse Waters appearance, Kennedy argued that the United States COVID death toll resulted partially from its treatment policies. He contrasted the U.S. with countries that he said provided ivermectin, hydrochloroquine, and other treatments, claiming some experienced dramatically lower COVID mortality. So, how many prominent ivermectin advocates explicitly discussed its adverse effects while they were encouraging people to consider using it? I would say very, very hard to find. I had to look and look and look. Maybe I missed a few of them, but in general, these were prominent people downplaying adverse effects and encouraging other people to take it. Are they all in on the game? Not likely, but they get a message. They get message from their handlers, push ivermectin. People should earn our trust, not be given out freely like our time. The USA refuses to give its own citizens health care. Pretty extraordinary for them to help Africa for free. But it wasn't really free. People died and live with harm today. Why Yemen? Well, the Saudis. That piece of the rainforest. Robbery and murder are their thing. The black flies they keep talking about. There are more than 2,000 species of black flies worldwide. Most do not transmit river blindness. So countries with black flies include the United States, Canada, UK, Germany, Sweden, Norway, Finland, France, Japan, Austria, Brazil, Mexico, and many countries across Africa have black flies, okay? So I don't know. Did they pick out a black fly for a reason? Because they're really everywhere. But when you read the literature, you start thinking black flies. Maybe that's a specimen that I don't know about. And I start thinking, well, I'm not any fly expert, right? The few flies I've seen appear to be black, right? So I kept thinking, well, why is this one black fly in Africa causing all these problems, right? And then we have the Yanomami. They occupy one of the largest protected indigenous territories on Earth. Well, there are many people and organizations trying to help the Yanomami remain on their ancestral land. The situation is mixed. There have been measurable progress since Brazil declared this is the important part. Brazil declared a health emergency in 2023. The Brazilian government, which has increased medical care and carried out operations against it. So what's going on is there's all these gold mines going on in the area. These poor people are getting hit from all angles. And then along comes the government in 2023 and declares it a health emergency. When they declare things health emergencies, that's a pretty big deal, right? They get even further isolated. And then the Brazilian government is the one who comes in with increased medical care. So, yeah, I have a lot of reasons to be a little bit suspicious here, right? And NGOs, including the Rainforest Forest Foundation in the United States, Greenpeace, and others that support healthcare, land monitoring, and legal protection are all there. So, yeah, I don't know. Merck and Company started in Germany. They became the United States, you know. I put this entire file together because I found information from a man named Tim Truth. He posts under that name. He was the one that got me started on this part of the ivermectin, because even when I reported on Africa earlier in the Carters, I missed the part about the damage to the DNA and all of that. And then along comes Tim Truth with this explosive information about all the harms to ivermectin. And that is what motivated me today. So my hats are all the way off to Tim Truth and his crew for coming up with that. But you have to remember, all of these people online are still getting funded. Who and why? They want you to think autism, that it came from a vaccine. Well, look inside your own home. I would propose that autism is likely coming from the sulfur exposure. I will not stop for a moment. Call me your Italian auntie. You may have to lean closer to actually hear me. Come a little closer so I can talk to you, my little darlings. And I have something to say to you. You better learn to sit up straight. Sit up straight and keep that head on a swizzle is my advice. I have more to say. How this all got started with ivermectin is only one piece. The other part, well, I don't like to compare, but the other part is actually more explosive and more deadly. So, and it also traces how this all got started. But I am just too tired and old today, so you'll have to tune in for the rest of the story. Be safe out there, and goodbye for now.